When the final credits rolled on Death Has a Shadow, the pilot episode of Family Guy Seth MacFarlane felt a rush that was equal parts triumph and terror. He'd made it. He'd crossed the invisible line that divides daydreamers from doers, college thesis projects from primetime TV, scribbles in a sketchbook from a living, breathing show airing right after the Super Bowl. But as he left the studio that night, riding a cocktail of caffeine, disbelief, and the smell of stale fast food from the writer's break room, Seth knew the hardest part wasn't launching Family Guy. The hardest part would be keeping it alive. Because the truth was, Fox hadn't greenlit the show with full-throated confidence. If anything, the pilot was a calculated risk. The network was still riding the towering success of The Simpsons, the gold standard for adult animation. They'd gambled before King of the Hill had worked out nicely. But Seth's offbeat, sometimes mean-spirited suburban family, laced with pop culture grenades, was another beast entirely. Inside Fox's offices, the buzz was anxious. Some execs saw potential: Seth's fresh college kid energy, the edgy humor, the bold cutaway gags. They thought it might resonate with the generation raised on reruns of The Simpsons, but hungry for something more absurd, more brash, more reckless. But others were skeptical. The Parents' Television Council was already foaming at the mouth about the baby who wanted to kill his mother. Complaints trickled in from the same people who'd once written angry letters about Bart Simpson's catchphrases. The premiere's ratings gave everyone just enough hope to lean forward, but not enough to relax. Yes, the Super Bowl had handed them millions of eyeballs. But what would happen when Family Guy had to survive on its own? Could it keep people watching on a random Tuesday night? Could it justify its budget modest by prime-time standards, but still a risk for animation? Fox's mid-level execs crunched the numbers late into the night. Nielsen ratings, the lifeblood of TV back then, came in batches that felt like verdicts. The show did okay, then dipped, then spiked when people tuned in for curiosity's sake. There was promise in the core demographics: young men, college kids, that sweet advertising goldmine that networks chased relentlessly. And so while the suits argued and the moral watchdogs ranted on local news channels, Seth and his small army of writers and animators kept their heads down and worked. They pushed scripts through tight deadlines, debated punchlines, and squeezed every last joke they could into 22-minute slots that might keep the lights on for another month. Some weeks, Seth lay awake at 3 a.m., wondering if it was all about to collapse. He was barely in his mid-20s, suddenly in charge of a primetime series that could crash and burn if he didn't keep it weird enough to stand out, but not so weird that Fox's execs pulled the plug in a panic. Behind the scenes, the tension didn't kill the creativity. It amplified it. Seth's stubbornness became legend among the tiny team packed into cramped offices near the Fox lot. Her animators worked brutal hours, storyboards pinned to every corkboard and taped to every door. Writers scribbled half-finished gags on napkins and pitched them between bites of takeout Chinese food. If the show was going to survive, they had to earn every laugh. The small victories gave them hope. A joke that got a genuine belly laugh in the table read. An early review that grudgingly admitted Family Guy might be smarter than its fart joke suggested. A late-night fan letter scrawled in pencil by a college kid in Iowa who swore he'd never laughed harder in his life. Fox noticed not all at once, but enough to hedge their bets. When the final numbers for Season 1 landed on the table, they were good enough, just good enough to buy the Griffins another shot. So they did it. They ordered Season 2. Not a sprawling order, not carte blanche. Just enough to keep the wheels turning. A few episodes at first, then maybe more if the audience stayed hungry. It wasn't exactly a vote of supreme confidence. It was more like a probation period, the entertainment equivalent of, we're watching you, don't blow it. Seth didn't care. Renewal was renewal. More episodes meant more chances to push the envelope, to dial up the weirdness, to prove that Family Guy could become the next big thing, or at the very least, the next cult classic. Meanwhile, the cultural climate didn't get any friendlier. The Parents' Television Council doubled down, naming Family Guy among the worst shows on TV for kids to accidentally stumble across. Religious groups called it depraved. The censors flinched every time a new script landed on their desk. Every joke, every off-color line, every cutaway gag that crossed the line became a skirmish in a war that never seemed to end. But in dorm rooms across America, that war only made Family Guy cooler. Late-night college kids, bored teenagers, new parents up at 2 a.m. rocking fussy babies, they were discovering the Griffins and finding something that felt forbidden. And in that rebellion was the seed of a loyal following, tiny but loud. For Seth and his team, the second season was more than just a reprieve. It was a dare. If Fox wanted them to play it safe, they were about to get the opposite. The writers sharpened their pens. The storyboard artists filled entire hallways with absurd sight gags. Seth set his jaw and decided if they were going down, they'd do it on their own terms, big, brash, and completely unapologetic. So the lights stayed on. The coffee pot stayed brewing. The Griffins, for a little while longer, stayed on the air. And just like that, Season 2 of Family Guy was born, not with a trumpet blast of triumph, but with a scrappy, reckless grin. A grin that said, "We're not dead yet." And so that scrappy, reckless grin became the rallying flag inside the cramped, often overheated animation offices where Family Guy's second season took shape. With the lights still on, the writers huddled closer, the pencils got sharper, and the boundaries that Fox's censors clung to, like fragile life rafts, drifted further and further from shore. If the first season was a polite knock on prime time's front door, Season 2 was Peter Griffin, blasting it off its hinges with a stolen cannon, and Seth MacFarlane gleefully lighting the fuse. The vibe in the writer's room was a strange brew of desperation and exhilaration. They'd tasted what cancellation might feel like, the endless phone calls from agents, the quiet goodbyes over after-hours beers at the corner bar on Pico Boulevard. The feeling that maybe this whole thing had been a beautiful, chaotic fluke. But now that they'd clawed back a chance, every line of dialogue felt like an act of rebellion. They didn't sit around politely asking if a gag might offend someone's aunt in Nebraska. They asked, would Peter do it? Would Stewie say it? And if the answer was yes, and the censors screamed, so be it. They'd find a way. They always did. By then, Seth's leadership style was legend among the small, tight-knit crew. He wasn't just the creator. He was the show's beating heart, its snarky backbone, and the first to remind everyone why they were there. He'd show up early, coffee in one hand, half-finished doodles in the other, and roam from cubicle to cubicle, pitching half-baked bits that somehow bloomed into viral catchphrases and iconic cutaways. One moment he'd be mocking a line reading from Peter. The next, he'd be pacing behind an animator's chair, arms crossed, eyebrows raised, as he pushed for something funnier, weirder, sharper. If a joke fell flat at the table read, he'd toss it back in the pot, daring the room to top it, and someone usually did. There were no big egos allowed to get precious about scraps that didn't land. They were all disposable, all up for grabs if it meant building an episode that punched harder than the one bar. And they needed that punch, because the battle lines with the censors were growing clearer by the week. If the network saw Season 1 as risky, Season 2 felt like a middle finger wrapped in a prime time slot. Family Guy didn't just push the envelope, It used it to make a crude paper airplane and crash it straight through a stained glass window of polite TV decorum. There were moments when the show almost got itself pulled mid-production. Some jokes were killed outright by Fox's Standards and Practices Department. But the writing team learned to play the game. They'd intentionally insert jokes so outrageously unairable that when the censors flagged them, the ones they really wanted to keep suddenly looked tame by comparison. It was a poker bluff with fart jokes and incest gags, and it worked more often than it should have. Meanwhile, the characters themselves were mutating, evolving under the pressure of staying alive. Peter's stupidity became a sandbox for increasingly absurd scenarios. If Homer Simpson was a lovable doofus, Peter was an unhinged man-child willing to light his hair on fire if it made his buddies laugh. He didn't just do dumb things. He existed to embody the dumbest impulses buried in every dad who'd ever flopped on a couch with a cheap beer and half-baked scheme. Stewie, the original evil genius, discovered new depths of weirdness. The writers realized they'd struck comedic gold with a villainous baby who mixed Shakespearean threats with diaper jokes and closet sexuality. They leaned into it. By season 2, Stewie's schemes were bigger, bolder, and weirder time machines, mind control devices, space lasers, and occasional slips that hinted he might not be quite as straight as his big-headed baby self claimed. It was taboo and slyly progressive, at once exactly the kind of layered trouble Family Guy loved to stir up. Brian, the talking dog with the soul of a disappointed intellectual, evolved too. He wasn't just a gimmick anymore. He was Seth's stand-in. The wry, frustrated voice who pointed out how insane the Griffin household really was. When Peter burned down the backyard for the third time, or Lois found herself enabling yet another of her husband's idiotic adventures, it was Brian's dry commentary that grounded the absurdity, reminding viewers there was a conscience somewhere in Quahog, even if it was wearing a flea collar. The magic, though, was never just in the characters. It was in the way the team refused to follow the rules that stifled other sitcoms. The infamous cutaway gags, which some critics dismissed as lazy, were their secret ingredient. Other shows set up punchlines with careful setups. Family Guy blew right past the setups, slammed on the brakes mid-scene, and took viewers sideways into an off-kilter blink-and-you'll-miss-it tangent that sometimes had nothing to do with the plot and everything to do with gleeful nonsense. The chicken fight. Kool-Aid Man smashing through the courtroom walls. Peter insisting, "Remember that time I..." Only for the show to leap out of narrative reality and into a wild pop culture parody, a music video, a hyper-violent Looney Tunes homage. No idea was too weird. If it was funny, it stayed. If it wasn't, it got rewritten until it was. It all built toward a strange paradox. The more Family Guy thumbed its nose at polite sensibilities, the more its cult following grew. College dorms were buzzing. Bootleg tapes later, dodgy downloads on Kazaa and LimeWire carried the Griffins from living room to dorm basement to the new chaotic frontier of online fandom. And Seth's crew watched this slow, scrappy cult fandom form with equal parts pride and anxiety. They knew they'd tapped into something that felt raw, juvenile, and shamelessly clever, the perfect mix for kids raised on The Simpsons, but hungry for something nastier. The ratings didn't always match that underground love. Some weeks, the numbers dipped low enough to set off alarms back at Fox headquarters. The threat of the axe hung over every storyboard like a storm cloud. But the fans were starting to make noise. Online forums and primitive fan sites bristled with theories, quotes, and gifs long before social media made that easy. Early memes lived on cheap websites and message boards where Stewie's catchphrases and Peter's moronic wisdom found a second life. Meanwhile, Seth played the role of ringleader, half genius, half chaos merchant, cajoling his team to go bigger, wilder, and nastier than the last time. If Season 1 had announced Family Guy to the world, Season 2 was Seth pounding his fist on the table, daring the world to try and shut them up. So they sharpened their pencils. They drained the coffee pots. They scribbled and argued and laughed until sunrise. And through it all, they understood something crucial. Staying alive in prime time wasn't just about survival. It was about proving sometimes the loudest, crudest, weirdest family in America could outlast polite expectations. They were betting everything on that idea, and by the end of Season 2, that bet would teeter dangerously close to losing. As Season 2 reached its final stretch, the air inside the Family Guy bullpen grew heavier with every new episode delivery. The jokes were sharper than ever, the cutaways weirder, the moral panic from watchdog groups louder. But so was the creeping dread that Fox might still pull the plug before the last animators could even clean up their desk drawers. The writers could feel the storm brewing in the margins of every meeting. Ratings meetings grew tense. Fox's notes piled higher. Advertisers liked the youth appeal, but flinched at jokes about bestiality. Stewie's weaponized baby genius antics, and Peter's parade of wildly inappropriate gags. Family Guy was no Simpsons. It didn't hide its teeth behind a sly wink. It bared them openly, and for a lot of mid-level execs, that was too much risk for too little payoff. But that threat didn't slow the team. If anything, it turned those cramped production offices into a bunker, the kind where you stock up on snack wrappers, cold coffee, and an us versus them mentality. Seth MacFarlane, who by now had become a 20-something veteran of last-minute script rewrites, refused to bow out quietly. If they were going to get axed, they'd do it so loudly that people would talk about it for years. By then, Family Guy was leaning into its defining weirdness. The chicken fight gag, which would later become one of the show's most famous running bits, was born out of this go big or go home attitude. Peter fighting a man-sized chicken for seemingly no reason at all, across rooftops and streets, smashing cars, crashing through windows. It was the show's thesis statement. Nothing is too stupid or too big if it makes us laugh. Each new episode felt like a dare. If the censors let something slip through, the writers figured out how to push it a step further the next week. When an off-color joke got yanked, Seth would stand at the whiteboard and sketch out 3 more to replace it. Animators stayed late, scribbling thousands of frames for sequences that might be scrapped by a nervous network the next morning. Nobody cared. The point wasn't just survival. It was going out with a bang so spectacular that even cancellation couldn't erase it. And yet, underneath the mischief and bravado, there was a quiet dread. The threat of cancellation turned the small Family Guy crew into a family of their own, a tribe of young weirdos who believed in the same stupid, brilliant, reckless cartoon. They celebrated late-night wins with cheap beer at neighborhood dive bars. They took long, bleary-eyed walks through Burbank streets when the coffee ran out and the deadlines loomed too close to breathe. Sometimes they'd find themselves in Seth's cluttered office at midnight, rerunning the same 10 seconds of animation again and again to nail a single laugh. Sometimes they'd stare at a blank script page, half delirious, wondering if this was the punchline, if they'd all poured heart and soul into an experiment doomed to get memory hold after 2 short seasons. But then the mail came in. The fan letters scrawled in smudged ink, typed out in all caps by teenagers in basement bedrooms, doodled with weird Peter Griffins sketches in the margins. The early message boards kept pinging new posts. It wasn't millions yet, but it was enough to feel like somebody out there cared that Quahog existed. They clung to that lifeline. If they couldn't count on Fox's faith, they could at least count on a scrappy underground audience who loved that Family Guy was just a little too nasty, a little too juvenile, a little too weird for polite dinner table TV. Meanwhile, Seth poured himself into keeping the characters alive, not just in the literal sense, but as living, growing, evolving creatures who could outlast the studio's cold calculus. Peter got dumber and funnier. Stewie's violent threats turned more operatic, his hints of something deeper and stranger just out of reach. Brian became the voice that cut through the nonsense with his signature brand of booze-soaked wisdom and bitter truth bombs. Lois and Meg, too often the show's punching bags, found occasional moments of strange tenderness, just enough for fans to root for them in between all the cutaway chaos. Back then, nobody could have predicted that these same characters would one day be icons, that people would cosplay Stewie at Comic Cons, that Peter Griffin memes would flood the internet for decades, that Quagmire's giggity would become a generational inside joke. Right then, they were just fighting to survive one more week. And survive they did barely. As the last episodes of Season 2 hit the air, the numbers weren't enough to guarantee safety. Fox's execs circled the show's time slot like vultures. Advertisers shuffled nervously. Critics clutched their pearls. But something stranger was happening behind the scenes, something none of those anxious meetings fully grasped yet. The reruns were quietly taking on a life of their own. Whenever Fox aired a repeat late at night, college kids tuned in. When they needed background noise at 2 a.m., something that wasn't a sappy rerun or an infomercial for miracle blenders, they flipped to Quahog. And they laughed. Then they taped it. Then they passed those tapes around dorm halls like a secret handshake. This wasn't supposed to happen with shows teetering on the edge of cancellation. Shows that died at the end of Season 2 usually stayed dead. But Family Guy was already proving it had more lives than anyone guessed. In those final days of Season 2, Seth and his crew stayed glued to their phones, watching the call logs light up with half-promises and nervous updates. Would they get a Season 3? Would they get the axe? Or would they fall into that twilight zone that killed so many weird, brilliant shows before beloved by a tiny cult, but not enough to matter to the suits upstairs? By the time the finale scripts were in, the team was exhausted, exhilarated, terrified, and weirdly proud. They'd done it their way, crude, clever, reckless, and true to what made them laugh. Whatever came next, a miracle renewal, a quiet cancellation, or something even stranger, they'd earned the right to say they never watered it down. And somewhere deep in his gut, Seth MacFarlane knew this was just the beginning. Even if the lights shut off tomorrow, Quahog had already broken out of its cage, and there was no putting the Griffin family back in the box. It happened the way so many TV deaths do, quietly, on a stale spring morning, with a short phone call that echoed like a bomb in the cramped production offices where the Griffins had first come to life. The same hallways that once buzzed with the scrappy hum of possibility now felt like the corridors of a funeral home. No big press release, no farewell parade, just a few blunt words from Fox. Family Guy was canceled. Some of the writers saw it coming. How could they not? The final Nielsen sheets for Season 2 hadn't exactly been the golden ticket Seth MacFarlane needed to keep Quahog alive. The late-night reruns were gaining an underground following, sure, but to the network bean counters, cult status meant nothing next to advertisers' nervous shuffling and the constant low drum of complaints from parental watchdogs. And so in spring 2000, after 2 seasons of wild, rule-breaking animation, Family Guy was quietly boxed up and shoved toward TV's vast graveyard of shows that could have been. For Seth and the crew, the news landed like a punch to the gut. But it wasn't the same flavor of defeat that kills ordinary shows. There was too much unfinished business. Too much raw energy still crackling in the margins. The final table reads were a bittersweet mess. Half heartfelt gratitude, half gallows humor. Writers joked about the inevitable revival even as they cleaned out their desks. Animators copied model sheets and scribbles as souvenirs. Seth walked the halls one last time, making jokes about turning Family Guy into a college puppet show if he had to. He'd always had a dark sense of humor about failure, but behind that grin was a gnawing frustration. They'd built something fresh, something dangerous, and network TV still didn't know what to do with it. Worse, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't dead yet, that somewhere out there, in late-night dorm rooms and second-hand VCRs, the show was quietly mutating, refusing to stay buried. When word spread that Family Guy was dead, the reaction was strange. The newspapers barely blinked. Critics who'd called the show lazy or offensive shrugged. But in the underbelly of the early internet, those sticky message boards and primitive fan sites, there was noise. Small at first, but persistent. Fans were ticked off. Family Guy hadn't just been a disposable cartoon to them. It was the show they watched when they were tired of the same sitcoms their parents liked. It was rude, juvenile, gleefully stupid, a secret club for anyone who felt a little too weird for polite TV. Seth leaned into that tiny cult energy as best he could. He gave sardonic interviews, promising he'd keep pitching the show to whoever would listen. He and a handful of diehards clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was a crack in the door somewhere. Meanwhile, the production offices emptied out. Storyboards got boxed up. The sound stages fell silent. The little pirate ship that had braved primetime waters and made millions of parents clutch their pearls was now drifting with no wind in its sails. But the crew didn't scatter entirely. Many bounced to other animation gigs Seth himself found side work, lending voices to other projects, taking meetings that mostly ended with polite no thanks, and studio execs who called him the kid who killed the talking baby show. He'd laugh it off, but inside, that label stung. A Family Guy was bigger than a joke about a homicidal baby. It was a Trojan horse for the kind of irreverence primetime hadn't seen in years, and it felt like the world was just about ready for that chaos, even if the suits weren't. Meanwhile, the Griffins stayed alive in the shadows. Local stations needed cheap late-night filler. Reruns went into syndication in weird time slots. The graveyard hours where insomniacs, stoners, and bored college kids discovered Peter, Stewie, Brian, Lois, and Meg like a half-forbidden relic. And every taped episode that changed hands, every pixelated file that crawled across early file-sharing networks, kept the characters breathing in basements, dorms, and dimly lit living rooms. By now, Seth had grown used to the weird paradox of Family Guy's death. On the books, it was gone but underground. It was alive and multiplying. A small but noisy army of fans refused to let it slip quietly into oblivion. The message boards roared. College kids scribbled Stewie catchphrases on dorm whiteboards. VHS tapes traded hands under cafeteria tables. And as the final episodes replayed on repeat at 1 a.m., the legend of Quahog stubbornly refused to fade. In that fragile afterlife, a seed was quietly germinating a second chance that nobody on the Fox lot could see coming. A twist that would turn a dead cartoon into the biggest Lazarus story in adult animation history. But in that spring of 2000, all Seth could do was wait, watch, and wonder if the weirdest family on TV really was gone for good, or if they were just reloading for round 2. So there Seth sat, half hero, half mourner, watching reruns flicker across late-night airwaves like ghosts refusing to cross over. The final call from Fox still echoed in his head. Family Guy was dead officially. The network accountants had filed it away as an experiment gone too far, too crude, too fringe for polite America. And yet, every time Seth flipped through channels at 1 a.m., there they were. Peter's dumb grin, Stewie's arched brow, Brian's dry sarcasm about a world that didn't quite deserve him. It should have been heartbreaking, but instead, it started to feel like a spark. Because the reruns weren't just reruns anymore. They were a pirate signal, a late-night secret handshake. And to the kids who stayed up too late, who traded bootleg tapes, who burned CD-ROMs full of grainy AVI files, Family Guy wasn't canceled. It was just hiding. It's almost impossible to overstate how weird this was for 2000. This was a pre-YouTube, pre-streaming, barely broadband internet. If you wanted an episode, you didn't just click watch. You lurked on shady forums, waited overnight for your dial-up to crawl through a 100-megabyte download, and crossed your fingers that the file was actually Family Guy and not someone's prank virus, and yet somehow the Griffins multiplied. College dorms turned into bootleg distribution hubs. Some kids stayed up for hours just to record reruns on VHS. They labeled tapes with scribbled FG notes and traded them like contraband. Late-night dorm parties always had the same soundtrack. Music, cheap beer, and that familiar theme song, It Seems Today, that all you see bleeding out of tiny dorm TVs, blurry and half-muted so the RA wouldn't knock. It wasn't just dorm kids either. Early message boards, those crude, blinking GeoCities pages, and easy boards started glowing with arguments about Peter versus Cell. Homer, best Stewie insults, favorite cutaways. Fans built GeoCities fan pages with pixelated GIFs of Peter falling down the stairs on loop. They wrote fan fiction. They made primitive memes. They clipped jokes out of old reruns and shared them in AIM chat rooms at 3 in the morning. In this ghostly half-life, Family Guy was alive in a way the suits at Fox could never measure. It didn't show up in Nielsen ratings or tidy ad revenue reports. It showed up in dorm room walls covered in Stewie posters. It showed up in poorly burned CDs labeled Peter Griffin, LOL. It showed up when a bored kid in Ohio cracked open LimeWire and saw Family Guy sharing space with Metallica bootlegs and the Matrix clips. And Seth, he saw it all. Every now and then he'd catch whispers from friends who still lurked on those fan boards. He'd see the surge in rerun ratings whenever a college town tuned in en masse. He'd show up at parties, half disguised, under a ball cap, and grin when he heard kids quoting lines they were never supposed to see twice. He also knew there was something bigger happening in the background, something even the execs at Fox couldn't control. See, at that same moment, another technology was quietly reshaping how Americans found dead shows, the DVD box set. What seemed like a dusty relic in the VHS era suddenly became the holy grail for cult shows. Fans who'd taped fuzzy late-night airings wanted a clean, official copy. They wanted behind-the-scenes commentary, deleted scenes, all the raw, uncensored chaos that broadcast TV couldn't touch. By 2001, Seth and a few loyal Fox insiders began whispering about a test run. What if we pressed the old episodes onto DVD? No huge marketing push. Just put it on the shelf and see if this underground hum was more than noise. The first Family Guy DVD set dropped like a test balloon, and when it hit store shelves, something strange happened. It sold, and sold, and sold again. Not just to hardcore animation nerds, but to college kids, bored teens, weirdos who felt like this scrappy, canceled cartoon was speaking directly to them. The sales numbers shocked the suits. Here was a show they'd all but buried, and it was outselling fresh hits, still chugging along in prime time. Every week, sales charts showed the same thing. Family Guy was not dead. It was undead. And its new life was funded by $20 at a time from kids who wanted to laugh at jokes too crude for Mom and Dad. And so the whispers grew louder. Fox Home Entertainment execs started wondering, could we bring this thing back? Syndication slots stayed full. The rerun numbers were suspiciously high for a dead show. Even the advertisers who'd once wrung their hands over the off-color jokes began to take another look. This wasn't a liability anymore. It was a phenomenon in waiting. Meanwhile, Seth was working the angles like only he could. He played it cool in public. Yeah, we're done. Maybe forever. But in private, he was pitching new jokes, sketching new cutaways, calling old writers in the middle of the night to test out lines that might never see daylight, but might, just maybe, be part of a resurrection plan if the stars aligned. He knew that bringing Family Guy back from the dead wasn't just about persuading Fox. It was about proving that TV had changed. That audiences could be louder than censors, funnier than execs, more loyal than any ad buyer's demographic chart. If he could keep the energy alive, if the DVDs stayed on top of the charts, if the rerun ratings held steady, maybe, just maybe, the Griffin family could claw their way out of TV limbo. It would take one more push, one last weird twist in a saga already full of cheap jokes and improbable luck. But even then, Seth knew. If the Griffins came back, they wouldn't come crawling. They'd kick the door down. They'd barge into living rooms like Peter Griffin at a neighbor's barbecue, uninvited, unstoppable, and guaranteed to break something. So the question wasn't if anymore. It was when. And while Seth waited, he sharpened his pencil, tuned his voices, and scribbled down ideas that would soon become the next chapter in a story that absolutely refused to die. The first Family Guy DVD box set was supposed to be a quiet experiment. A modest stack of discs, a handful of behind-the-scenes commentaries, a shiny cardboard slipcover that wouldn't stand out at the local mall's video store shelf. Nobody at Fox Home Entertainment expected a cultural event. They just wanted to wring a few extra dollars from a defunct show, maybe enough to pad the margins on their more bankable hits. But within weeks, that plain little box set morphed into a beacon, a weird totem, passed around college dorms like contraband. Kids who'd whispered punchlines under cafeteria tables were now stacking the DVD next to battered copies of The Simpsons, South Park bootlegs, and weird cult anime that traveled the same underground pipelines. Suddenly, every dorm room TV was a rerun festival on demand. No more waiting for Fox to rerun old episodes at 1 a.m. You could watch Peter, Stewie, Brian, Lois, and Meg whenever you wanted, drunk, half asleep, cramming for finals, or with a room full of stoned friends giggling at the chicken fight for the 10th time. The little cardboard box, 4 discs, cheap plastic cases gave Quahog a second heartbeat. It didn't take long for Seth to realize the ripple effect. He'd wander into big box stores just to see it. That weird moment when Family Guy DVDs outsold blockbuster movies. Parents browsed the aisles with their kids. Teenagers smirked as they dropped the box set onto the checkout belt like they were buying a ticket to an R-rated club no grown-up understood. Meanwhile, Fox's back office reports turned from confusion to disbelief. The same executives who'd once scowled at the Griffin family's crudeness now watched the sales ticker spin like a Vegas slot machine hitting 777s. Numbers poured in week after week. Hundreds of thousands of units moved. No expensive ad campaigns, no primetime slots, just word of mouth and a restless tribe of young viewers who loved the fact that the show was too rude to live on broadcast TV. Inside Seth's world, that raw underground energy turned into a secret engine. He'd spend nights scribbling fresh ideas in notebooks marked with doodles of Peter and Brian. He'd call former writers at weird hours. "Hey, remember that Stewie bit we cut because standards practices freaked out? What if we brought it back only bigger?" Some nights he'd crash parties, literal basement viewing parties where kids shouted punchlines ahead of the dialogue. He didn't announce himself. He'd just hang back, nursing a beer, watching the same 2 seasons he'd fought tooth and nail to make, now being devoured by people who quoted every line like gospel. Those nights fueled him. They were proof. Family Guy wasn't just a canceled show. It was a kind of rebellion, a crude, brilliant middle finger to squeaky clean sitcoms. It didn't care about your polite living room. It came blasting in with fart jokes, pop culture jabs, and cutaways that left censors scrambling for the bleep button. At the same time, something bigger was brewing in the TV landscape. DVDs weren't just saving Family Guy. They were reshaping what canceled even meant. Other cult shows, Futurama, Firefly, were finding second lives in the same plastic cases. Networks realized there was real gold buried in the graveyard of shows they'd killed too soon. But none were rising as fast or as loud as Family Guy. The first box set sold so well that Fox greenlit a second. The second sold even better. Seth started seeing fan forums explode with fresh conspiracies. What if they bring it back? What if they make a movie? What if Stewie actually wins next time? It all sounded insane, but the energy was real. Inside Fox, a few believers were whispering the same question. What if we uncanceled it? There was money on the table, easy money. Syndication slots filled late-night schedules on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim. Reruns there pulled numbers that rivaled primetime sitcoms, all from stoners and college kids who fell asleep to Stewie's monologues about world domination. By 2002, the Griffin family felt less like a ghost and more like a poltergeist. They haunted every part of the late-night TV ecosystem. They turned up in memes that flickered through primitive forums. Clips spread on shady peer-to-peer networks long before YouTube turned viral video into a business model. In basements and bedrooms, Stewie Griffin's voice bounced off cheap speakers, that prissy megalomaniac baby, becoming a countercultural anthem for every misfit who wanted TV to be weirder, ruder, and far more honest. Meanwhile, Seth kept the fires burning. Every meeting, every fan letter, every college kid who stopped him on the street, it all stacked up like fuel for a resurrection bonfire. He knew Fox needed to see one last undeniable thing, that the audience wasn't just niche. It was young, it was loyal, it was profitable. The same young adults who once taped episodes from late-night reruns were now dropping $20 a pop for a product they already technically owned. That kind of dedication was worth more than any marketing budget. But even then, bringing Family Guy back wasn't guaranteed. There were whispers of other shows waiting in line for a second shot. New primetime slots were rare and expensive. Advertisers still squirmed at jokes about priests, dogs dating humans, and the casual mayhem that defined Peter's worst days. Seth knew he'd have to prove that the Griffin family wasn't just a cult hit. They were a cash cow dressed as a grenade. So he waited. He took meetings. He pushed old writers to stay ready. He sketched new storyboards that would never see daylight unless or until Fox caved. And all around him, the low hum of Quahog never died. It pulsed through DVD sales, echoed in packed college dorms, hummed through grainy bootleg rips in lime-wire folders titled Stewie Kicks Ass. In the middle of it all stood Seth, older now than the wide-eyed kid who'd once drawn Fred Flintstone and dreamed up a talking baby bent on matricide. He'd survived his first cancellation. He'd watched the suits pull the plug on the weirdest cartoon on prime time, and then he'd watch the fans drag it out of the grave with nothing but word of mouth and cheap plastic discs. If there was a lesson there, he'd say it himself at bar tables and fan panels alike. Never underestimate a weird idea or the weirdos who love it enough to keep it alive. Somewhere in those final months of 2002, as the second box set hit record sales, Seth's phone rang again. Another quiet meeting, another hush-hush pitch. But this time, the conversation didn't start with why did it fail. Instead, it started with a question that made every sleepless night, every bootleg, every late-night rerun worth it. What would you do if we brought the Griffins back? And in Seth's mind, Quahog never stopped breathing. It just waited for the next chaotic chapter. The question still echoed in Seth's head, the one he'd waited years to hear spoken out loud by someone with the power to make it real. What would you do if we brought the Griffins back? It wasn't a joke this time. Not a half-hearted pitch tossed around between beers. Not a desperate fan theory typed at 3 a.m. on some half-broken GeoCities forum. This was a real question, asked across a polished boardroom table by an executive who, just 2 years earlier, had shrugged the Griffin family into oblivion. Seth didn't miss a beat. He leaned in, no showboating, no forced grin, just the same dark spark he'd carried since that first scribbled doodle of a talking baby. He told them what he'd always known. Family Guy had never truly died. It just needed a door kicked back open, and Seth had the crowbar ready. Behind that calm delivery was the truth, a relentless momentum built from every late-night dorm watch party, every worn-out DVD spinning in cheap college players, every underground fan site that traded pixelated clips like forbidden candy. The cult that Family Guy built had grown so loud it couldn't be ignored. Even the bean counters, the same folks who once called the show too crude for prime time, had run out of excuses when the sales reports hit their desks in blocky black ink. The kids want the Griffins back, and they're paying for it. So Seth made the pitch of his life. He didn't sugarcoat it. He told them the same stuff that made them nervous the first time. The show would stay weird. It would stay rude. It would stay sharp enough to poke holes in network TV's fake politeness. Peter wouldn't get any smarter. Stewie wouldn't mellow out. Brian would keep smoking cigarettes while lecturing you about Voltaire. And the cutaways? Oh, there'd be more and more chickens, more chaos, more surreal rabbit holes that turned a single punchline into 3 minutes of animated mayhem. And that was exactly what Fox needed to hear. Because for once, polite TV wasn't working like it used to. They needed loud. They needed young. They needed a guaranteed cult to rally around. Seth's promise wasn't just more episodes, it was a revival that would double down on everything that got them canceled the first time. In the new TV landscape, one brimming with edgy cable animation, Adult Swim reruns, and college kids who worshipped irreverence that was suddenly a selling point, not a liability. In that hush-hush meeting, nods turned into handshakes. Contracts were drafted, checks scribbled out, dusty model sheets yanked from filing cabinets like ancient treasure maps. The Griffins were no longer a rumor muttered on late-night message boards. They were a headline waiting to break. And Seth? He barely paused to celebrate. He called the old writers. He called the new ones. He called animators who'd since scattered to other studios and asked if they were ready to drop everything and come home to Quahog. Most said yes before he even finished the pitch. Fox made it official in 2004. Family Guy was back, not as an experiment, but as a full-throated resurrection. The first major broadcast TV show to come roaring back from the grave purely on the back of DVD sales and rabid fan demand. It was unheard of. It was unthinkable. It was so perfectly Family Guy. The production offices that once echoed with that final hollow phone call in 2000 now buzzed again with paper rustling, voices reading out jokes about dogs writing novels and toddlers plotting metricide. The desks filled with new storyboards, half-finished doodles, and rows of old VHS tapes that someone dug up as reference material just to remind the crew where they'd come from. There was pressure, of course. The world was watching. Other shows wanted to see if a DVD cult could really resurrect a mainstream hit. Fox wanted numbers. Seth wanted freedom enough rope to let the show get weirder than ever, but not so much that the suits would panic again. Meanwhile, the underground fans who'd spent years keeping the torch burning now found themselves with an official banner to rally under. College kids who'd bootlegged fuzzy AVIs now bought new seasons in shrink-wrapped DVD boxes. They wore Family Guy t-shirts to class. They filled forums with frame-by-frame breakdowns of new jokes, pointing out callbacks to the weird, canceled years when nobody else was paying attention. And so, with a few sharp pen strokes and a wave of green light energy, Seth and his ragtag band of misfit writers, voice actors, and animators once again sat in cramped offices stacked with pizza boxes, half-empty coffee cups, and scribbled lines that made the censors sweat bullets. The chicken fight came back. The pop culture jabs sharpened their claws. Stewie's megalomania dialed up to 11. Peter's stupidity doubled in scale. Brian's existential crisis deepened with every sip of cheap martinis, and Seth, now older, sharper, and just a little more dangerous, steered it all with the same smirk he'd worn as an animation student doodling Larry and Steve in a wrist dorm room. If the first run was about proving Family Guy could exist, the second was about showing it could thrive no matter how many times someone tried to kill it off. It was proof that TV had changed, that audiences had changed, that sometimes the weird kids in the basement with bootleg DVDs know better than the men in suits upstairs. And as the new episodes crackled to life cutaways, musical numbers, scandalous gags that danced gleefully on the line of too far, the legend of the show that refused to die only grew bigger. In the dim hum of studio lights and digital ink, Seth cracked his knuckles over fresh pages of script. The cult was now a full-blown army, and Quahog was back, messier, louder, funnier than ever. And just like that, the lights in Quahog flickered back on. But if Seth and his resurrected crew thought that bringing Family Guy back would mean smooth sailing, they were in for a rude awakening. Because once the balloons popped and the comeback headlines faded, reality settled in. Reviving a canceled show was one thing. Keeping it alive under a microscope was a whole other battle. When the first new scripts slid across the writer's room table, the air felt electric and anxious. They all knew what was at stake. On one side, there was the cult that brought them back the dorm room fanatics, the college weirdos who wanted Family Guy to push boundaries harder than ever. On the other, a nervous network, a new primetime slot, and a fresh batch of advertisers quietly crossing their fingers that Peter wouldn't say something that'd get them all sued before the next commercial break. Seth naturally leaned into the chaos. If the DVD cult had proven anything, it was that the weirder Family Guy got, the more loyal its people became. So the new episodes wasted no time. They dropped into the schedule with chicken fights twice as long, jokes that leapt shamelessly across the line of good taste, and cutaways that had the censors calling at all hours of the night. But that boundary pushing came with constant tug-of-wars. Every script meeting turned into a negotiation. Could Peter jump naked out of a moving car? Could Stewie plot another patricide scheme and still sneak past standards practices? Could Brian say what everyone was thinking about politics, religion, and pop culture? Or did they have to dial it down just enough to survive Fox's Monday morning meetings? For Seth, it was a familiar dance. He learned early on that the only way Family Guy could exist was if it stayed a few steps ahead of the people trying to kill its jokes. So the writers perfected the art of burying the wildest bits under layers of even wilder bits. If the censors wanted to cut line A, they'd happily cut line B instead, leaving the real punchline untouched. It was a creative high-wire act that turned late-night script rewrites into a kind of savage sport. Meanwhile, the fans, the same diehards who'd spent their college years passing around bootleg DVDs, showed up ready. They tuned in week after week, hungry to see if the new Family Guy would keep the same offbeat DNA that made it a secret cult. They weren't disappointed. If anything, they got more than they bargained for. The Griffins came back with sharper teeth, a bigger budget, and a swagger that practically dared critics to shut them down again. It worked, but not without new scars. Early episodes of the revival drew big ratings, but just as many angry letters. Advocacy groups who'd missed the first run now found a new target. Jokes about religion, race, politics, celebrities, nothing was safe, and the show's second life stirred fresh outrage from watchdogs who'd hoped Family Guy would stay in its grave. Some advertisers flinched. Local news stations aired shocked segments. Did you hear what Stewie said at 8:30 on a Sunday night? Even some Fox insiders braced for the same old calls from conservative lobbyists. But here's the thing. Every time controversy flared up, the audience numbers flared up too. The more parents complained, the more teenagers tuned in. The more the censors bleeped a line, the more fans clipped it, ripped it, and traded it online. And behind every spike in headlines and ratings, Seth just grinned. He knew that for Family Guy to survive, it needed to live on that edge. It needed the moral scolds to shout from the rooftops, because that was the fuel that kept the Griffin family relevant. If polite primetime was a safe choice, Quahog was the antidote America secretly craved. A crude, chaotic funhouse mirror held up to pop culture and politics, right when people wanted a reason to laugh at all the absurdity. Backstage, the writers leaned harder into the freedom the DVDs had earned them. They revisited ideas that got shot down the first time. They resurrected abandoned cutaways that once seemed too bizarre for network TV. They pulled old jokes from dusty files, added twice as many punchlines, and aimed them straight at the same gatekeepers who once declared the show too controversial to survive. Meanwhile, the new cast and crew settled back into that scrappy underdog mindset. Voice actors doubled down, improv lines slipped into final takes, and animators tested the limits of how far a single sight gag could stretch before someone at Fox said, "Are you serious?" If they were serious, the answer was always yes, and watch it's going to land. But the second life didn't just mean more of the same. It also meant risk, because this time, failure would stick. No amount of bootleg DVDs would save them if the new episodes flopped. So Seth kept the team sharp. He kept pitching bigger, wilder arcs. He hunted for the next running gag that could take its place alongside the chicken fight, or the endless road to adventures with Stewie and Brian. Every table read felt like a test run for a show with 9 lives, and every Monday morning, ratings call either tightened or loosened the leash from upstairs. So far, the numbers stayed strong. The cult had morphed into a mainstream juggernaut, a weird hybrid of old-school fans, curious new viewers, and a network realizing they'd stumbled back into one of the most bankable headaches in TV history. And through it all, Seth sat at the eye of the storm, the same kid from Kent, Connecticut, who once doodled Fred Flintstone knockoffs and dreamed of talking dogs and baby villains. He watched as Family Guy refused to settle down, refused to mellow out, refused to fade politely into syndication reruns like so many safe sitcoms before it. Instead, every new script pushed Quahog deeper into America's living rooms, a half hour of gleeful, reckless, sometimes brilliant anarchy that somehow made prime time feel dangerous again. It was proof that the Griffin family's second chance wasn't a fluke. It was a warning shot. No matter how many times you pulled the plug, as long as a single DVD spun in a college dorm, Peter, Lois, Stewie, Brian, Meg, and even that weird, evil monkey in Chris's closet would always find a way to crash the party. And they were just getting started. By the time the first new season settled into Fox's lineup, it was clear to anyone paying attention. Family Guy wasn't just back. It was bulletproof. The same scrappy, weird energy that once doomed it now made it untouchable. If anything, every scandal, every angry letter, every bleeped-out line only reinforced the legend. This show was too alive to kill. Yet behind the scenes, Seth and his writers knew the comeback wasn't about coasting on shock value alone. They'd learned that from the first run. The real trick was turning that raw cult power into a structure, a pipeline of jokes, gags, and pop culture lightning strikes that would keep Quahog weird for years, not just one lucky revival. So the office whiteboards filled up again. Half-baked jokes about Peter doing something unspeakable to a Thanksgiving turkey set side by side with long arcs where Stewie and Brian time-traveled into ever-stranger versions of American history. The staff pitched bigger musical numbers, weirder side plots, and surreal running bits that connected old-school fans to new recruits. And the audience? They stuck around. If anything, they multiplied. The first Resurrection episodes hit higher ratings than some of the final runs of the original series, a shocking reminder that, this time, Family Guy wasn't just a fringe cartoon for late-night stoners. It was becoming a mainstream anchor for Fox's comedy lineup, something that would sit shoulder to shoulder with The Simpsons in Sunday's sacred animated block. For Seth, that was surreal. It was the weird misfit show that had once been too brash to exist, now rubbing elbows with the very TV royalty that had inspired him as a kid in Kent. But even in the middle of that golden moment, Seth never let the team forget what Family Guy really was, an underdog story that only survived because the people watching demanded it survive. So they fed the beast. They leaned into the cult status. Merch exploded. T-shirts, mugs, novelty Stewie bobbleheads all winked at the fact that the show was still a rebellious middle finger to safe network TV, even if it now came bundled in shrink-wrapped big box sets next to The Simpsons and King of the Hill. Meanwhile, inside the writer's room, the culture stayed chaotic by design. New voices joined the old guard, fresh minds ready to push Stewie deeper into sci-fi time loops, weirder alternate realities, and twisted subplots that made network censors reach for the red pen all over again. Some weeks, the Griffin family teetered on the edge of total implosion. Ratings could slip. Advertisers could flinch. Standards practices could threaten to pull an episode at the last second, but every time the axe hovered, the same stubborn truth slapped the suits back into place. Family Guy was a cash machine precisely because it made people uncomfortable. So the show doubled down. Stewie's sexuality got more layered. His identity crisis spilled out in jokes so coded and chaotic that fans dissected them for years. Brian the dog turned from simple comic relief to a walking existential crisis, spouting half-drunk monologues about life's pointlessness while dating human women and failing novels in between. And Peter just kept being Peter, the dumbest, weirdest American dad alive, a man who could get his hand stuck in a Pringles can and start a holy war in the same episode. In the middle of this glorious mess, Seth kept his promise to himself. The show would never get comfortable. If it ever did, that would be the real death sentence. So they blew up plot lines, brought back fan-favorite sidekicks, cooked up callbacks so deep that only the basement-dwelling DVD diehards would notice. It all added to the living legend. Family Guy wasn't just a show, it was a prank that never ended. A running joke at the expense of safe television. And as the second run powered forward, the echoes of that original cancellation never quite vanished. They hung over every late-night rewrite, every censorship brawl, every new piece of merch. It was a reminder. Family Guy was never supposed to make it this far. It was a zombie cartoon. Resurrected by sheer fan hunger, animated stubbornness, and a creator too weird to play by the old rules. By the time the Griffin family anchored themselves as a Sunday night fixture once again, the message was clear to the fans, the censors, and every other TV misfit scribbling jokes on the backs of napkins. If you build something so strange that it shouldn't exist, and if people love it enough, even the graveyard won't hold it down. So the Griffins roared on Peter, punching chickens, Stewie dreaming of world domination and personal confusion, Brian sipping martinis with one paw on a typewriter he'd never finish. And Seth? He watched it all unfold, fully aware that the resurrection was just another chapter, and that Quahog's weird, untamable heartbeat was only getting louder. The cult wasn't going anywhere. If anything, it was only growing hungrier. So there they were, back in Quahog, louder than ever. The fans were ravenous, the DVD cult now a prime-time army, and Seth's once-doomed cartoon now rubbing elbows with The Simpsons every Sunday night like it had always belonged there. But if the Griffin family revival taught Seth MacFarlane one thing, it was this. When you stand this close to the edge, it's only a matter of time before someone tries to push you off again. The first signs of trouble didn't come from ratings. Those were solid. They didn't come from the fans. They were thriving, howling for more Stewie world domination, more Peter stupidity, more Brian nihilism disguised as martini-soaked charm. The threat came from the same place it always had. People who thought a cartoon about a dysfunctional Rhode Island family might just be the end of decency as we knew it. If the Griffin family was a cult hit before, now they were a lightning rod, a living, breathing target for moral guardians, parental watch groups, and late-night news anchors desperate for something scandalous to fill 10 minutes between weather and sports. It started small. A church group in the Midwest tried to get the show banned locally, too crude for kids, too much swearing, too much everything. Local affiliates flinched, but Fox didn't budge. Every protest letter seemed to double the ratings next week. Then came the real hits. National headlines, talk show debates. Is Family Guy ruining America's youth? Pundits wagged fingers, fans made memes, and Seth? Seth just poured another coffee, sat down in the writer's room, and asked, how far can we push it next? The show doubled down because that's what Family Guy did. If the censors thought a joke was too far, they'd write 3 more just like it. If a cutaway gag about a celebrity scandal made lawyers sweat, they found an even bigger target next week. The Griffin family leaned into the fire. Their revival wasn't just surviving the storm, it was feeding on it. The cast and crew felt it too. Table reads turned into group howls of disbelief. Are we really going to say this on TV? They always did. Voice actors cracked up mid-line. The audio editors left the outtakes in their personal files, a private vault of moments that almost pushed the show off the cliff completely. But even as the headlines screamed, "Cancel them again!" the numbers told another story. Family Guy was bulletproof. The controversies weren't nails in a coffin, they were fuel for the bonfire. Every time a politician ranted about Peter Griffin being a terrible role model, the show sold another 1,000 DVDs. Every time Stewie's lines made a watchdog faint, The reruns clocked higher views. And deep down, Seth knew this was exactly what Family Guy was built for. If you didn't have people begging for its head on a spike, you were doing it wrong. The show was never polite. It was never meant to be comfortable. It was a mirror held up to pop culture's worst impulses, warped, cracked, hilariously mean. So the storm came. The Griffin family didn't flinch. They built storm shelters out of gags too ridiculous to die and punchlines too risky for a polite company. And as the moral panic flared up, Quahog just got weirder. Episodes about religion, war, sexuality, politics, no sacred cow left ungored. If the network wanted to pull the plug a second time, fine, the cult would resurrect them again. Backstage, the writers huddled around old clips from season 1 and 2 looking for loose threads, lost characters, gags that could come roaring back to slap censors awake. Seth encouraged it. He didn't want the new Family Guy to get soft just because it had found success again. If anything, it had to stay wilder, bigger cutaways, sharper satire, longer chicken fights. The world had changed since 1999, Quahog hadn't, and that was the point. At fan conventions, kids lined up wearing homemade Stewie for President shirts, quoting lines that would make their parents blush. College dorm rooms glowed blue from marathon rewatches. The same DVDs that had once sparked the first resurrection, now stacked alongside new box sets. Proof that the legend was alive even as news anchors fumed and censors begged for mercy. For Seth, the irony was delicious. The show they'd once called Dead on Arrival was now Primetime's biggest middle finger to the idea that TV comedy had limits. Family Guy wasn't just back, it was bulletproof, radioactive, and blissfully, gloriously offensive to anyone who thought cartoons should behave. And so, as the storm howled outside, the Griffins huddled in their familiar living room. Peter as clueless as ever, Lois rolling her eyes, Brian swirling his drink, Meg the eternal punching bag, and Stewie, that tiny tyrant, smirking like he knew he'd outlived them all. Because deep down, he did. So the Griffin house stood firm wind howling outside, headlines screaming that the sky was falling, moral watchdogs barking at every FCC hearing like the apocalypse was encoded in Seth's scripts. But inside that cluttered writer's room, the vibe was different. It was electric. It was conspiratorial. It was exactly how Seth MacFarlane liked it. They'd made it through the first run on sheer stubbornness, a handful of loyal freaks, and a dorm room army spinning scratched DVDs until the discs cracked. But this second storm, this was about turning controversy into currency and turning that currency into unapologetic weirdness that made the censors sweat buckets every week. Inside those cramped offices, the revival felt less like a polite TV comeback and more like a pirate ship that had seized control of Fox's Sunday lineup. The doors rattled with arguments about how far they could push a joke before the red ink hit the script pages. They fought about which taboo to break this week. They debated if a single cutaway gag should burn 60 seconds or 5 whole minutes if they stretched it into one of those glorious, absurd detours that turned punchlines into mini-movies. In that chaos, Seth found fuel. He roamed the halls between sessions, voice cracking from recording Peter, Stewie, and Brian, back-to-back 3 personalities, stitched together by the same smirk that said, "What are they going to do? Cancel us again?" He'd duck into the sound booth, tweak a line on the fly, then step back out to a dozen writers pounding energy drinks and scribbling on whiteboards covered in chicken scratch notes like, "Cutaway. Peter gets knighted by Queen for farting in Parliament." Or Stewie builds time machine again, but what if Brian just wants to bang Shakespeare's wife? No idea too weird. No punchline too dark. No throwaway gag too expensive, if it landed just right. The DVDs had proven that fans would pay again and again for the scraps the network once thought were too crude for prime time. Now those scraps were the crown jewels. But the show's new primetime run wasn't just feeding the original cult. It was making new ones. High school kids who were toddlers during season 1 were now quoting Peter's dumbest lines in the lunchroom. College freshmen discovered entire subreddits that treated Quahog lore like sacred text, debating whether Stewie's British accent was a cover for his real persona or just an inside joke that Seth never wanted to explain. And Brian? Half the fan base swore they were Brian, disillusioned, overeducated, and secretly certain they were too good for the world that paid their rent. Meanwhile, the chicken fight evolved into an in-joke that got funnier every time it happened. Fans would tune in just to see if this was the episode where Ernie the giant chicken would crash through the ceiling, drag Peter into another city-spanning, physics-defying slugfest, only to leave the plot gasping for air when they stumbled back in, bruised and bloodied like nothing ever happened. And that's what Family Guy did best. It broke its own reality every single week, yet somehow stitched itself back together in time for next Sunday. There was chaos made comforting, nonsense made necessary. In an era when other sitcoms carefully reset the status quo, the Griffins gleefully shattered theirs with each episode. Outside that writer's room, of course. Not everyone was laughing. Local affiliates sweated every time a preview tape landed on their desk. Sponsors tried to read between the lines, how bad is it this week? Will Peter mention a real politician? Will Stewie threaten mass destruction in ways that made Fox's legal team pour extra whiskey into their coffee mugs? Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes they dialed it down just enough to pass standards practices, but always with an even nastier joke waiting around the corner. That was Seth's dance. Slip the envelope through, then hide the real bomb behind it. The audience knew it. The censors knew it. And both sides stayed locked in that weird codependent brawl that made Family Guy the unstoppable prank it was. Yet under all the fart jokes, crude cutaways, and taboo poking, the writing staff understood that the heart of the show was weirdly sincere. It had to be. Otherwise, it wouldn't have survived 2 cancellations. The Griffins were still a family. Peter's idiocy only worked because you knew deep down he'd take a punch for Lois. Lois's exasperation only worked because she chose chaos every day. Brian's hypocrisy stung because it was real a dog too smart for his own good, preaching virtue while stumbling through every vice. And Stewie was still the insecure baby genius plotting to kill his mom because nothing was funnier than watching a toddler talk like a megalomaniac in an Oscar Wilde tuxedo. So the writers leaned into the contradictions, heartfelt moments smashed up against the crudest gags on TV. One minute, Peter's telling Meg she's worthless. The next, he's taking a bullet to save her from a mall Santa gone rogue. Stewie might plot global domination at breakfast, but hug his teddy bear Rupert with the tenderness of a kid just trying to figure himself out. That push-pull, gross and sweet, cruel and loyal, kept the fans hooked. It gave Family Guy a weird emotional anchor, a sliver of honesty beneath the chaos. If it were just dumb jokes, it would have faded out like a novelty. If it were just sweetness, it would have drowned under the weight of safer shows that did wholesome better. The magic was in the collision. And so, in the dead of night, when the censors were asleep and the fan forums were on fire, Seth and his crew stayed up pushing the next big gamble. What if Quagmire got a whole episode? What if the evil monkey in Chris's closet had a tragic backstory? What if Stewie and Brian got entire road trip specials that turned cutaways into full-blown musicals? Every idea that made the suits nervous made the cult lean in closer. Outside the studio walls, the storm kept howling. Advocacy groups threw fresh protests at Fox's doorstep every month. Local news anchors clutched their pearls on air, but the ratings kept climbing. The DVDs sold out every holiday season. The same church groups that banned the show only made the kids want it more. By the time the second run's first season wrapped, Family Guy had done the impossible again. They'd survived the graveyard, flipped the moral panic into marketing, and proved that no amount of polite outrage could kill a show that never wanted to be polite in the first place. And as Seth stood in that humming studio hallway, walls covered in rough pencil sketches, of Peter's blank stare and Stewie's diabolical grin, he knew one thing for certain. The real joke was on the people who thought cartoons were just for kids. Because the Griffin family's new primetime throne wasn't built on safety. It was built on the unstoppable laughter of people who wanted TV to stay weird, reckless, and just a little bit wrong. And it would take more than another storm to tear that throne down. So there it was, the moral panic, the headlines, the think pieces on whether Quahog's dumbest dad was poisoning the American family dinner table. Seth's pirate ship was still afloat, sails patched with lawsuits and FCC memos, but the winds were shifting. The controversy that fed the Griffin cult didn't come cheap, and Fox's accountants started running numbers that made even Seth sweat. The Griffin family was still riding high on loyal fans. The DVDs still flew off shelves. The reruns still spiked ratings for local affiliates, desperate for easy late-night gold. But primetime is a fickle beast. You're only as valuable as the ad dollars you bring in. And Family Guy, for all its outlaw charm, was expensive. Every cutaway gag, every full-blown musical, every absurd fight sequence that left Peter buried under an exploding gas station, it all cost money that could easily be spent on safer, tidier sitcoms that didn't make half the country angry every week. And yet Seth and his crew didn't dare play it safe. How could they? Playing it safe was how you got forgotten, so they turned up the volume. The cutaways got longer, the jokes got darker, the fights got bloodier. Every episode, a middle finger to the idea that primetime TV was only for bland, nuclear families living behind white picket fences. But behind closed doors at Fox, the mood soured. The accountants frowned. Advertisers flinched when a joke about Jesus slipped past censors and triggered an uproar on Sunday morning news shows. Well, lobby groups ramped up campaigns to get affiliates to drop the show if you actually did. And even the die-hard fans, as loud as they were, didn't always show up in the ratings box when Fox needed them most. So the rumors started again. Could Family Guy survive another blow? Would lightning strike twice? Seth heard the whispers. Some writers even started hedging bets about how many episodes they had left. But the mood in the writers' room didn't break. If anything, it sharpened. If the end was coming, they'd go out swinging. So they wrote faster, bolder, weirder. The scripts that came out of that final stretch of the early years were pure ID storylines that spat in the face of what TV should be. They tore holes in their own continuity, let characters break the fourth wall just to call out Fox for cutting their budgets. They put out episodes that felt like middle fingers to the idea of cancellation itself. Stewie's schemes got more unhinged death rays, cloned evil twins, accidental soft spots for his mother that made him even angrier. Brian morphed into the walking embodiment of Seth's inner cynic. Always right in theory, always wrong in practice. A dog who could see the world's hypocrisy while drowning in his own. And Peter? Peter became the king of reckless sitcom dads, the final evolution of every bumbling TV father that had come before, turned up to 11, and armed with a full cartoon physics license, to to ruin everything in sight. Fans ate it up. Critics winced, laughed, called it cheap, called it brilliant sometimes in the same sentence. But the numbers still dipped when they needed to climb. DVD sales were a gold mine, but ad slots in the primetime block were bleeding. Fox, the network that had gambled on Seth's pencil sketches in the first place, now quietly weighed the cost of constant backlash against the shrinking ratings charts. Then came the axe. For the second time in 2002, the suits called time of death on Quahog's weirdest family. No grand send-off, no final speech. Just a cold memo, a handshake, a promise that the reruns might keep the lights on for a while, but prime time was moving on. For Seth, it stung, but not in the same way as the first time. Back then, the death of Family Guy felt like a personal failure. Now, it felt like a dare. Because this time, there was no doubt in his mind that the Griffin cult wasn't going to roll over and die. They'd been here before. They'd done the unthinkable once. And if Fox thought it was over for good, well, they clearly hadn't learned how stubborn Family Guy fans could be when they smelled blood. Inside the fandom, the news spread fast. Forums exploded. College dorms threw cancellation parties with bootleg Stewie posters taped to beer-soaked walls. Kids traded burned DVD copies like contraband. Cartoon sites ran tribute columns, meme pages immortalized Quagmire's filthiest lines, Stewie's sharpest threats, Peter's dumbest moments. And behind the scenes, Seth didn't disappear. He took meetings. He bided time. He watched the reruns rack up ratings on Adult Swim, a late-night rebirth that felt like a bootleg broadcast for the insomniacs and outcasts who kept the Griffin family alive while the network moved on. Some nights, he'd stand in that same studio hallway, walls still covered in doodles and storyboards from the early days, and think, this isn't the end. Not really. Because the thing about Family Guy, the real reason the storm never won, is that it was built on an audience who liked being told no. The more the censors pulled the plug, the more the cult gathered, traded, laughed, and demanded more. And more was coming. They didn't know it yet, but another resurrection was brewing in basement dorm rooms and late-night DVD binges. Quahog's grave was only temporary. The Griffin family had mastered the art of dying young and coming back weirder than ever. So when the lights dimmed on the prime time slot once more, it wasn't a funeral. It was an intermission. One final cliffhanger before the cult would rewrite the rules of TV again. They'd seen this cancellation before. And this time, they were ready to break the grave open all over again. All right, this is the moment when we crack open the tomb again, when the fans become the executioners and the saviors at the same time. We're not just writing history, we're writing a legend you can hear in the static hiss of a bootleg DVD spinning in a dorm room at 2 a.m. So buckle up, we're picking up the torch right where Chapter 4 slammed shut. Fox thinks they buried the Griffins. The cult is about to prove them wrong again. They said it was over again. The studio lights shut off, the pencil sketches left pinned to corkboards in dark hallways, half-finished jokes abandoned in folders that no one was supposed to open ever again. The suits at Fox moved on, washing their hands of Quahog and its bad influence, its FCC fines, its late-night complaint calls from horrified parents who'd stumbled on Peter Griffin doing God knows what with a giant chicken at 8 p.m. on a Sunday. But outside the Fox headquarters, the real show never stopped. It just changed format. In dorm rooms, basement apartments, and secondhand DVD shops, Family Guy mutated into something bigger than primetime. It became contraband, a trophy for the kids who'd missed it the first time or weren't old enough to stay up late when it aired, for the ones who weren't supposed to watch it but did anyway. The secret weapon? A shiny silver disc, cheaply pressed, slipped into cardboard sleeves that barely hinted at the chaos burned into the plastic. The Family Guy DVD box sets. Fox figured they'd squeeze a little leftover cash out of the weirdos who'd kept asking about Stewie and Brian. Maybe clear the warehouse, make space for some safe new sitcom that wouldn't upset the neighbors. What they didn't count on was this. The DVDs sold fast, faster than anyone expected. Word spread like wildfire across campus hallways and cafeteria lunch tables. Hey, you know that cartoon that got canceled? Yeah, you have to watch this scene. Here, just borrow the disc tonight. One disc turned into two. Two turned into 3 seasons, stuffed into cracked jewel cases passed hand to hand like bootleg punk CDs in the 80s. A generation that didn't have Quahog in prime time now had it on demand, no censors, no commercials, no chance to say stop when Peter did something so impossibly stupid you wondered how the writers ever pitched it with a straight face. College kids who'd grown up on The Simpsons realized they'd found something dirtier, weirder, and meaner, and they loved it. They ran marathon viewing parties, quoting entire scenes by heart, rewinding Stewie's monologues until they could mimic his pitch-perfect fake British sneer. And somewhere between all those scratched discs, spinning at 2 a.m., something bigger started happening. A pulse, a hum, a rumor that maybe, just maybe, this dead show wasn't dead at all. So the DVD spun, and spun, and spun. What Fox now thought would be a quiet cash-out turned into an underground phenomenon. You couldn't walk a dorm hallway in 2003 without hearing Stewie's insults blasting from behind a cracked door. The glow of a cheap TV bouncing off a wall cluttered with empty pizza boxes and half-finished term papers. In those cramped dorms, Peter Griffin's idiocy and Brian's disillusionment were a bonding ritual, every line a test to see who'd laugh too loud when they weren't supposed to. By day, the same students half slept through lectures, eyes glazed, running on caffeine and last night's Family Guy binge. By night, the same kids piled onto ragged couches, swapping discs like contraband, quoting lines they weren't supposed to quote in polite company. They didn't care that the show was dead. Or maybe they cared because it was dead. There's nothing cooler than a banned cartoon your parents hate. What made the revival special wasn't just the DVDs. It was how the show infected the early internet. Forums sprouted overnight old-school message boards with clunky usernames, neon fonts, and signatures packed with Stewie gifs. Whole threads debated conspiracies. Did Brian represent Seth's true voice? Was Stewie secretly gay or just coded that way? Was Quagmire based on a real creep Seth met in college? Every theory made the legend bigger. And then, like a spark on gasoline, Cartoon Network threw open the basement window, Adult Swim. In the graveyard hours, when respectable TV had long gone dark, Family Guy rose again, rerun by rerun, out of its prime-time grave. The same episodes that triggered censors and melted advertiser nerves at 8 p.m. now landed perfectly at midnight, sandwiched between Aqua Teen Hunger Force and C-Lab 2021. The weird kids, the insomniacs, the kids who missed it the first time, they found it again. But now it felt like an initiation ritual. You're one of us if you stay up late enough to hear Stewie plot matricide between bong rips and microwave burritos. Fox wasn't blind. The overnight ratings for these reruns were shockingly high, higher than most new shows they were desperately trying to launch in the daylight hours. The same kids who'd bootlegged the DVDs were still showing up night after night, laughing at the same jokes they'd seen 10 times already. Advertisers took notice too. Suddenly there was money in selling energy drinks and sketchy CD-burning software to sleep-deprived teens hypnotized by Peter's idiocy. And deep in Seth MacFarlane's mind, gears turned. He'd gambled on the idea that the cult would keep the flame alive. But this wasn't just a candle, this was a bonfire. He fielded late-night phone calls from old colleagues. Have you seen the Adult Swim numbers? Did you see the DVD sales this quarter? Asterisk. Are you thinking what we're thinking? By now, Seth had other offers. He could have walked away, maybe built something brand new, something less exhausting than keeping Peter, Brian, and Stewie's unholy trio alive. But why abandon the monster that wouldn't die? Every piece of fan mail that trickled in kids, quoting jokes word for word, parents confessing they'd caved and started watching too, told him the truth. The Griffins weren't going anywhere. So the cult got louder. Online petitions mushroom, bring back family. Guy threads popped up on college forums, nerd blogs, and early social media sites where low-res Stewie memes spread like wildfire. College radio DJs joked about it. Stand-up comics dropped punchlines about Peter Griffin's ghost show that refused to stay dead. Some fans even staged half-joking, half-serious protests in front of local Fox affiliates. Hand-painted signs reading, "We want Quahog," waved by kids who probably hadn't voted in a real election, but would riot if their cartoon family didn't come home. Meanwhile, the DVD sales hit milestones that made execs swallow hard. Millions of units moved. Rerun ratings that made late-night slots profitable again. Merch that trickled into Hot Topic and random mall kiosks. Stewie plushies, Quagmire mugs, T-shirts that made your grandma gasp when she saw the punchline. And the Griffin family just sat there, frozen in time. That living room, that couch, that TV, that cheap piano sting at the end of every half-baked cutaway. They weren't going anywhere. They were waiting, not for permission, but for a phone call Seth knew was inevitable. When it came, it was almost anticlimactic. Quiet, businesslike. The same suits who'd shaken his hand years before now, asking if he'd like to sit down and talk. Maybe this dead show wasn't dead after all. Maybe the fans were louder than the censors this time. Maybe, just maybe, there was money, real money, in putting the Griffin family back in prime time. And behind Seth's polite grin, the dorm kids and the midnight cult knew exactly what he'd say. He said yes, because once you learn how to come back from the grave, you never stay buried for long. They thought the story was over. The suits closed the books, the studio halls fell silent, and Quahog sat frozen, a ghost town of scribbled gags and half-finished punchlines gathering dust in filing cabinets nobody wanted to open. But out there in the real world, the Griffin family was very much alive. They flickered late at night on dorm TVs, their voices echoing down campus hallways, thick with stale pizza and cheap beer. Stewie's threats, Peter's idiocy, Brian's dry complaints they survived, multiplied, became a secret handshake for kids too stubborn to watch what their parents told them to. And the DVDs? They didn't just sell, they roared. Those plastic discs moved from friend to friend, from dorm room to dorm room, cracked cases stuffed into backpacks like contraband. Every time one spun in a dusty college DVD player, it sparked another laugh, another quote, another new fan ready to yell, "Why did they ever kill this?" They turned reruns into rituals. They turned canceled episodes into cult scripture. They turned Seth's half-joke about resurrecting a cartoon into a business plan. Inside Fox, the execs noticed. At first, they shrugged some fluke, some dorm room phase that would fade away when kids graduated and got real jobs. But the numbers didn't fade. They grew. The rerun slots on Adult Swim didn't just fill time, they exploded. Insomniacs and weirdos tuned in religiously, giving midnight airtime better ratings than some new primetime sitcoms ever managed. Then emails started. The calls. College kids writing in half-drunk at 3 a.m. Bring it back. Fans plastering forums with bootleg memes, homemade petitions that looked half joke, half religion. Some intern at Fox tried to count them once they gave up. The Griffin family wasn't just some show anymore. They were a rallying cry, a middle finger to TV rules that said, once you're dead, you stay buried. So, behind glass office doors, the same network that killed the show twice sat down with calculators and spreadsheets, realizing they might have murdered a cash cow by accident. The DVDs kept topping charts better than new sitcom box sets, better than safer cartoons that never made anyone angry. Every midnight rerun poured quiet dollars back into the machine they thought they'd unplugged for good. And somewhere in the middle of that was Seth, not the same fresh grad with a student film and a handshake deal anymore. Older, sharper, famous enough to take meetings other canceled showrunners never got. He watched the cult grow from the sidelines, watched the fans fight for his show harder than any press campaign ever could. He knew what was happening. He knew what they wanted. And when the call came, he knew exactly what to say. But it wasn't instant. It wasn't some dramatic single phone call where Seth walked in and declared, I want my show back. It was meetings, lots of them. Polite apologies from the same suits who'd once ordered him to tone it down, cut it short, make it safe for family hour. Now they wanted to know what it would take to bring the family back. Seth didn't gloat much. He just listened. And when they asked what he'd need, he told them freedom and the pull-in punches. More budget for cutaways that blew up the timeline. Musical numbers that shouldn't fit in a cartoon's runtime. More time slots that didn't shove them off the air when one parent group wrote too many angry letters on a Sunday night. Fox crunched the numbers. Seth read the contract lines. They found common ground on one simple fact. This show was too alive to stay dead. So the Griffin family clawed out of the grave for a second time, but now with an army behind them. The fans weren't just watching. They were recruiting. They'd proved that when you love a canceled cartoon this much, you can bend a network back to your will. Back in the writing rooms, the old crew trickled in some young, some older, some ready to blow out every half-buried joke they'd never got past the censors the first time. The whiteboards filled up again. New plots, bigger gags, weirder tangents. If Family Guy was going to be back, it would be back louder. The old limits were off. The cult expected it. Seth promised it. When word leaked, it always leaks, the forums melted. The petitions got crossed out and turned into party invites. College radio hosts announced it before news outlets did. DVD sales spiked again, because now every fan needed the full collection, the proof they'd kept the family alive when no one else would. So when Fox made it official, the announcement didn't hit like a polite press release. It felt like a flag planted on TV history's graveyard. Family Guy is back. Again. The cult didn't just win, they changed the rules. They showed TV that you can't kill what the audience keeps breathing life into. And Seth? He smiled behind that microphone, slipped back into Peter's dumb laugh and Stewie's venom, and knew. This time, Quahog wasn't going anywhere soon. Once the first handshake was done and the lawyers had played their part, Seth found himself back in the same polished boardrooms where he'd once felt like a kid sneaking into the grown-ups club. But now he wasn't the kid begging for a shot. He was the guy who'd proved the network wrong twice. and that shift in power changed everything. He asked for budgets that made the bean counters wince but sign anyway. He asked for animation tweaks, crisper lines, faster turnaround, the freedom to push gags right to the line without a room full of anxious censors. And maybe most importantly, he asked for breathing room. The early years had been frantic. Deadlines, rewrites of rewrites, cutting gags to please the time slot. This time, Seth wanted the writing rooms to breathe, riff, argue, break the stories until they were weird enough to feel new again. Back at the studio, old animators returned like veterans, opening a time capsule. Some had moved on to safer shows, kids' cartoons, neat Saturday morning slots, where no one called you at midnight about a joke that might get a letter from the FCC. But Family Guy was gravity. If you'd once drawn Peter falling down the stairs in 10 different slapstick angles, you wanted to draw him again, falling harder, weirder, this time with Stewie operating a homemade rocket launcher in the background. They worked late, fueled by pizza boxes and half-warm coffee pots. Storyboards covered walls floor to ceiling. Deleted jokes from the canceled seasons resurfaced on Post-its stuck to computer monitors. Remember this? Let's do it now. Some punchlines got sharper in the second pass. Some got darker. And some were so niche, the team knew only the true cult would catch them, and that was the point. The inside jokes weren't bugs. They were the DNA that kept the Griffin family alive in the shadows all this time. Meanwhile, the rumor mill never stopped grinding. Fan forums that once traded bootleg VHS tapes and burned DVDs now dissected grainy phone pics of storyboards accidentally leaked by some intern. Who was that new background character? Was Quagmire finally getting a storyline so wild it might break broadcast TV for good? Was Stewie really about to drop his first actual F-bomb? Half of it was wishful thinking, half total nonsense, but the fact that the rumors existed at all was proof of what Seth had known in his bones. The cult would always want more. Then came the guest calls. When Family Guy first aired, the idea that A-list celebrities would line up to get lampooned by an evil toddler and a drunk dog was absurd. But now, everyone wanted in. Rock stars, washed-up sitcom actors, serious Oscar winners who secretly adored the show and quoted it at dinner parties, they all said yes. Some begged for parts so small you'd miss them on first watch. Some asked Seth to draw them doing the stupidest possible thing they'd never be allowed to do on a polite primetime show. And Seth obliged. Nothing was too weird for Quahog. And if the fans suspected the revival would get soft, they were dead wrong. The early script Seth signed off on made the original run look like training wheels. Jokes they'd once cut for being too edgy now survived table reads without flinching. It was like everyone understood the deal this time. If you resurrect the Griffin family, you don't bury the claws. The censors still tried, of course. But in the same rooms where they used to hold back gags with apologetic memos, they now faced writers armed with cult stats and DVD sales numbers that spoke louder than moral panic ever could. Meanwhile, Seth found himself juggling more than just the show's script. He was now the bridge between the old guard and the writers who'd bled to make Family Guy weird in the first place, and a new generation of animators and gagsmiths who'd grown up watching the show they were now writing for. Some of them had literally worn out their DVD box sets as teenagers. Now they were pitching cutaways for Stewie and Brian in the same room as the guy who gave them life. Talk about meta. The Griffin family was once again Quahog's loudest tenants, and the world noticed. TV critics who'd once penned polite obituaries for the show now sharpened their knives in the opposite direction. Could lightning strike twice? Would the revived Family Guy push too far this time? Seth didn't bother answering. He just fed the cult. Because the real answer wasn't in think pieces. It was in college dorms and living rooms at 2 a.m., where someone was still quoting Peter Griffin lines while they microwaved leftover pizza. So the stage was set. The cult had cracked the coffin open. The network had backed away from the hammer and nails. The Griffin house was dusted off and ready, and somewhere on that same ragged couch, Peter Griffin leaned back, TV remote in one hand. Stewie clutched his world domination blueprint in the other. Brian raised his glass, and the family that refused to stay canceled kicked their feet up, right back where they belonged. So there they were, Peter on the couch, Stewie scheming at his side, Brian swirling a cheap martini in one paw, Lois sighing like she always does, somewhere between exasperated and weirdly proud that this impossible circus was alive again. The lights in the Griffin living room glowed brighter than they had in years. But outside that cartoon house in the real world, the real story was just getting its second wind. Because the second Family Guy came back, it wasn't just about new episodes airing on Sunday nights. It was about the cult that wouldn't sleep, the fans who'd carried Quahog in their backpacks, and half-broken DVD players, the kids who knew every cutaway gag by heart, who could recite Stewie's entire plan for world domination while standing in line for midnight pizza. These were the people who never gave up when the network pulled the plug the first time. Now they were getting paid back in full. It started with the rerun marathons Fox lining up the old episodes like trophies, daring new viewers to see how this weird, crude cartoon had infected pop culture under the radar. College dorms turned it into background noise for everything. Parties, all-nighters, heartbreaks, half-finished term papers. If you walked down a hallway on any campus worth its salt in the early 2000s, you could hear Peter's voice leaking under door cracks like some half-sinister anthem for kids who liked their comedy just a little bit wrong. And it worked. The new episodes dropped like bombs. The jokes were faster, the cutaways sharper. There was a sense unspoken but thick in every line that Family Guy had survived the kill switch once and would never, ever apologize for it again. The cult saw it, felt it, fed it. They made memes when memes were barely memes yet. They built fan pages, bootlegged clips, spliced Stewie's best one-liners into ringtone files they'd trade over clunky flip phones. Meanwhile, the DVD sales didn't dip, they spiked. Fans who'd bought them the first time doubled up. Special editions, behind-the-scenes commentaries, deleted gags that would have been impossible to sneak on primetime TV, even in the Anything Goes revival. They wanted to own it all, every scrap, every rumor, every scrap of story that said this show survived because we made it so. Fox, once so quick to swing the axe, now leaned back and counted the coins quietly, pretending they'd always believed in it. But the cult knew better, and they loved reminding everyone. College kids wore I Saved Family Guy shirts, half ironically, half legendary. Seth leaned into it too, late-night interviews, DVD extras, sly commentary tracks where he'd remind you that this show was your show. He just kept it alive. You brought it back. Behind the scenes, the writer's room grew its own mythology. New writers came in, not to clean up the old house, but to scribble new graffiti on the walls. They pitched gags that bounced off the edges of reason. If the censors balked, good. That meant they'd done it right. Some jokes went too far, or way too far, but that was half the thrill. If you wanted polite, you had a million safe sitcoms. If you wanted a foul-mouthed baby threatening nuclear war, or a talking dog pontificating about Nietzsche while hooking up with random bar girls, you tuned in here. Every Sunday night premiere felt like a dare. How much can we get away with? And every Monday morning felt like a badge of honor when watchdog groups clutched their pearls and the internet howled with half-offended laughter. For the cult, controversy wasn't a problem. It was the lifeblood. They knew every time some moral panic flared up, another million kids would sneak an episode when their parents weren't looking. Seth watched all this with that sly grin he'd perfected since his wrist days. He knew the math now. The more you said Family Guy shouldn't exist, the stronger it got. The more people said Family Guy was too dumb, too crass, too chaotic, the more the cult leaned in. It was a feedback loop that even Fox couldn't break now. Not without admitting they'd misread the appetite for a dumb dad, an evil baby, and a talking dog turned philosopher. The Second Coming became folklore in real time. College papers ran think pieces about how Family Guy was punk rock for cartoons, a slap in the face of polite sitcoms, a gleeful vandalism of TV's golden rules. Professors used it in media studies classes, ironically. Kids who once got scolded for watching it in high school were now writing essays about it for credit. Nothing makes a canceled show feel more alive than being forced to analyze Peter Griffin's fart jokes in a lecture hall. The revival didn't just cement Family Guy's survival, it changed the blueprint for everything that came after. Other shows looked at the Griffin resurrection and thought, wait, you can do that? Canceled cult hits suddenly sprouted Save Our Show campaigns like mushrooms after rain. DVDs became weapons. Fan petitions turned serious. Networks learned that what they called low ratings might just mean too ahead of its time for your spreadsheets. And in the middle of all that chaos, the Griffin family didn't change. That was the best part. They didn't learn a moral lesson. They didn't grow up. They didn't soften the edges. If anything, they got worse, meaner, weirder, sharper. Peter's brain shrank. Stewie's weapons got bigger. Brian's romantic failures got more humiliating. Quahog stayed Quahog, a place that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. Quahog stayed Quahog, and that was the promise, the unspoken contract between Seth, his rowdy crew of writers, and the fans who'd glued the Griffin family back together with sheer force of will. Every time they aired a new episode, it felt like a middle finger raised at the laws of TV gravity. Shows weren't supposed to come back from the dead twice. Shows weren't supposed to insult their own network in the same breath they thanked it for the paycheck. And yet here they were, rolling fresh cutaways every Sunday night, like a machine built to break the polite TV mold piece by piece. And the cult kept feeding it. Fan sites exploded primitive by today's standards, but back then they were wild frontiers. Forums packed with kids arguing about whether Stewie was truly evil or just misunderstood. Late-night threads dissecting Peter's dumbest quotes, line by line like Shakespeare for idiots or geniuses, depending on how you looked at it. Bootleg GIFs churned out on free dial-up connections. Fan art so bizarre, Seth once joked in interviews that half of it would get the show banned if they tried to animate it for real. But that was the secret sauce. Family Guy didn't just tolerate its weird fandom, it thrived on it. The writers read those forums. They lurked in those threads. Sometimes they lifted jokes straight from fan conspiracies and turned them into canon gags. Sometimes they mocked the same fans who adored them, and the fans loved them more for it. Where other shows tried to please everybody, Family Guy doubled down on pleasing the kids who'd stuck by them when the network didn't. They knew where their bread was buttered. Meanwhile, the merch wave hit like an aftershock. Quahog jumped off the screen and landed in dorm rooms, lockers, late-night sketch pads, T-shirts, mugs, band posters. Bootleg vendors outside college campuses hustled Family Guy knockoffs next to cheap band tees and pirated concert DVDs. Official merch barely kept up with the black market, but nobody cared. Seth knew the real currency wasn't a mug with Peter's face on it. It was the fact that people cared enough to want it at all. Inside Fox, the lesson landed hard. You can kill a show on paper, but if the fans keep it alive in bedrooms, classrooms, and sketchy forum threads at 3 a.m., the corpse just sits up and asks for a budget. Executives started paying attention to DVD numbers, like gospel. Other showrunners started whispering about fan power like it was a spell if it could bring Family Guy back. Maybe it could resurrect them, too. The Griffin family wasn't just a cartoon anymore. It was proof that TV wasn't a one-way street. It was a fight you could win if enough people laughed loud enough, long enough together. And in Quahog, that victory showed up in the work. The new seasons didn't just match the old chaos, they turbocharged it. Old jokes came back meaner. Running gags that once felt like throwaways evolved into weird meta loops that only die-hard cult kids fully caught. The chicken fights grew from goofy skits into multi-minute epics that shattered the pacing just because they could. One moment you'd have a normal sitcom plot. Next thing you knew, Peter was flying a stolen jet through a desert canyon, while the soundtrack shredded every sense of logic. Stewie, once just an evil baby with matricide on the brain, found new layers that nobody could have predicted back in the shaky first pilot. The baby with the football head didn't soften, but he expanded. Time travel. Alternate universes. Questionable sexuality jokes that only the cult really understood. Brian's endless midlife crises. Peter's stupidity that somehow kept mutating into accidental brilliance. Every piece the fans loved got stretched, poked, twisted, and blown up to see just how far the world of Quahog could bend before it snapped. It didn't snap. If anything, the more the show leaned into its absurdity, the stronger the cult got. Because by then, Family Guy wasn't just a show, it was a dare. A test to see how far you'd follow Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, and Brian through every chicken fight, every awkward moral, every musical number that popped out of nowhere and made you wonder if the writers were just messing with you for fun. They were. The big revival arc made Quahog more than a punchline town. It made it immortal, a proving ground for TV's new rules. Cancel us if you want. But the fans own this house now. Kill us again. We'll just come back angrier, drunker, weirder. When that next wave of episodes wrapped, the cult didn't fade. They multiplied. New kids found reruns at midnight. Old fans came back to argue whether the new stuff was sharper or if the rough edges of the original run would always be sacred. It didn't matter. Either way, the Griffin family stayed lit up in living rooms that should have gone dark years ago. And Seth? He kept the grin. He knew better than anyone that you don't cage Quahog. You don't sand down the dumb dad or muzzle the evil baby or sober up the wise dog. You just crank the lights back on, pass out the popcorn, and let the cult do what it does best. Laugh too loud, quote too much, and keep that Griffin house standing long after the credits roll. You don't sand down the dumb dad or muzzle the evil baby or sober up the wise dog. You just crank the lights back on, pass out the popcorn, and let the cult do what it does best. Laugh too loud, quote too much, and keep that Griffin house standing long after the credits roll. When the Griffin living room flickered back to life and the cult got its crown, it wasn't just about some weird cartoon on Sunday nights anymore. It was a signal flare for what TV could become when it refused to play by the rules. The same show that had been tossed aside like trash in 2002 now stomped back in with a grin, a beer, a chicken fight, and a quiet promise to every misfit who'd ever felt like Quahog made more sense than the real world. We're not going anywhere. In those first fresh seasons after the DVD resurrection, you could feel it humming under every new episode. The jokes didn't tiptoe, they bulldozed. The cutaways didn't sneak by, they hijacked the narrative whenever they pleased. The writers were no longer terrified of a red pen striking through their favorite bad idea. If anything, they baited that red pen on purpose, daring it to strike so they could come back the next week and push the joke twice as far. And the fans? They didn't just sit back and clap politely. They egged it on online, offline, at midnight dorm marathons where entire floors would gather in stale air thick with microwave pizza to howl at the Griffin family's chaos. It became clear. Family Guy had broken free of the normal sitcom life cycle. It wasn't content to stay boxed up with dusty DVD sets or quiet reruns in the background. The cult had hardwired the show into pop culture so deeply that even people who didn't watch it knew the quotes. You could drop a freaking sweet in any college quad and someone would finish the line. Stewie's "Victory is Mine" started as a meme before meme was even the word. Peter's half-lidded grin, that brain-melting cackle they bled out of the TV screen and burrowed into dorm room walls like graffiti. No, but there was something deeper brewing, too. Something Seth MacFarlane could feel every time he stepped back into the voice booth. He wasn't just voicing Peter or Stewie anymore. He was steering a ship that didn't have a map. A ship that had already been sunk once and clawed its way back up because the audience willed it back. Most shows dream of riding the wave of a devoted audience, but this was a tidal wave that made the suits upstairs more nervous than ever. Because if fans could drag a dead show back to life once, what else could they do? So the writers leaned in. The jokes turned meaner, sharper, smarter, and dumber, at the same time that weird, contradictory sweet spot Family Guy always owned. Some episodes pivoted into raw, no-apology satire, poking at the same censors who'd once clipped their wings. Others leaned into the dumbest possible setups, a 2-minute brawl with a giant chicken, an extended musical number about absolutely nothing, and audiences ate it up. Every time a new episode dropped, old-school fans tuned in for the meta callbacks, the taboo-busting punchlines, the chaos that made the show feel alive. And new kids, just discovering the Griffins circus for the first time, gasped at jokes that made their parents slam doors in disgust. And that was the real power now. Family Guy wasn't just surviving. It was inheriting the next generation. Each wave of viewers made the legend bigger. Early fans handed down old box sets like Forbidden Relics. You think the new ones are crazy? Watch season 2. You'll see where this all started. College kids introduced it to high school siblings. High schoolers ripped clips for early YouTube and edgy MySpace pages. The cult mutated every year, bigger, louder, more bulletproof. In that weird unspoken pact between Seth and his army of misfit fans, there was an understanding. The show would never apologize for staying stupid, savage, or pointless, and the audience would never let it die again. The writers' room knew they'd never get that old leash back on. Anytime the network tried to tighten the reins, the fans pulled harder in the opposite direction. And so the cutaway gags kept blooming like weeds. The side characters, Quagmire, Cleveland, Joe all-sprouted plotlines so bizarre they'd have broken the first season's fragile shell. But the shell was long gone. What was left was pure Quahog. Open ground for Seth's team to plant the strangest ideas they could think up on too little sleep. Behind the scenes, that freedom came with a weight. After all, there's a fine line between a cult classic and a self-parody that burns out in its own excess. The team knew it some nights. The storyboards were a war zone of crossed-out gags and heated debates about how far was too far. But Seth's main compass never changed. If it made him laugh in that half-sinister, half-boyish snort that had powered Family Guy since the days of The Life of Larry, then it stayed in. The test audience wasn't a test audience, It was the same kids who'd once bought a scratched-up DVD at a sketchy used store to keep the Griffin family alive when nobody else would. By the time the first batch of revival seasons found its stride, the ratings told the suits what the DVD numbers already had. Family Guy was not a fluke. It was an institution now, not because it was polished or respectable, but because it refused to be either. Critics still hated it. The moral panic groups still whined. The censors still scribbled notes in red ink, but the people with battered remotes in dorm rooms and dingy apartments, they just kept watching and quoting and buying the next box set as soon as it hit the shelves. Back at the McFarlane camp, Seth started thinking bigger. The second life of Family Guy was never going to be about just writing the same gags forever. It was about seeing how many walls you could blow out without bringing the whole house down. If Quahog could survive cancellation once, who said it couldn't outlive the very idea of TV as everyone knew it? That kernel of impossible optimism hummed under every joke, every lowbrow gag, every ridiculous fight scene where a giant chicken obliterated the concept of plot. It wasn't just a comeback. It was a warning shot to the world of polite television. Kill us once, shame on you. Kill us twice. Good luck the cult's got the remote now. If the cult owned the remote, then Seth owned the fuse box, and every time the suits upstairs tried to dim the lights, he flipped every switch back on twice as bright. In those years after the resurrection, Family Guy became the cartoon that wouldn't just come back, it would come back louder. The jokes leaned harder into pop culture, politics, religion. Any sacred cow left standing got shoved straight into Peter's mouth so he could burp it back out as a punchline nobody else would dare write. And fans loved it. They didn't want subtle. They didn't want polite. They wanted to see where the line was, and they wanted Family Guy to cross it while whistling a show tune and swinging a rubber chicken. It was a strange kind of loyalty, and the more critics begged for cancellation, the more the cult watched. The more censors gasped, the more dorm rooms tuned in. For Seth, it was poetic. The same people who'd slammed the door in his face in the early days now watched him turn that same door into a revolving gag about how unstoppable the Griffin clan really was. And in the writer's room, the mantra stayed simple. We're only dead if we get boring. So they refused to get boring. Cutaways mutated into mini-sketches so deranged that network censors had to pick their battles or give up entirely. Musical numbers spiraled into absurd showstoppers. Recurring gags about Peter's clueless cruelty or Stewie's violent genius were doubled down on until they became character myths in themselves. The giant chicken brawls stopped pretending to be jokes. They turned into short films of nonsense violence that stomped, pacing into the ground for no reason other than because they could. Even the side characters, so easy to forget in any other sitcom, blossomed into fan-favorite monsters. Quagmire's depravity grew from a single gross punchline into an entire sub-universe of taboos so uncomfortable you couldn't help but cackle. Joe's tragedy of a paralyzed cop turned into a platform for sight gags so wrong you'd squirm and rewind to watch them again. Meg's punching bag status evolved into one of the longest-running anti-character arcs on TV, so pitiful that the cult adored her just for surviving the Griffin house at all. And Seth? He didn't just voice Peter, Stewie, and Brian. He was the puppet master behind every off-key note, every gory cutaway, every joke that made your grandma clutch her pearls and your college buddy fall off his futon laughing. He fed off the backlash. Every moral panic, every boycott threat, every whiny opinion piece and TV guide fuel for the furnace. In a world where most shows tiptoed to keep everyone happy, Family Guy grabbed that rule book, tore out a page, and used it to light its own fireworks. All the while, Fox, once the executioner, now basked in the unkillable glow. The DVD sales stacked higher. Merch flooded Hot Topic racks and dorm desks alike. Syndication checks rolled in. And the suits, once so sure they were done with this dumb cartoon, suddenly discovered they were all accidental co-conspirators in the biggest TV resurrection since, well, ever. But here's the thing that really locked in the legend. Family Guy made surviving look fun. So many cult shows crawled back from the grave only to grow safe, tired, apologetic, not Quahog. No one in the Griffin house ever learned a real lesson. Peter never got smarter. Stewie never ditched his evil streak, even if the guns got traded for time machines or musical stage dreams. Brian never stopped trying to seem smarter than he was, only to trip over his own hypocritical paws. The show refused to tie off loose ends because loose ends were the whole joke. Life in Quahog was chaos looping on itself forever. Outside the cartoon town's crayon lines, the world shifted too. Streaming was rising from the ashes of clunky DVDs. Old reruns on late-night cable gave way to entire seasons, dropped online in one savage dump, a buffet for the new generation, who wanted Peter and Stewie on tap 24/7. The cult got younger. The jokes got older and weirder. The college kids who'd once snuck episodes between midterms now showed their younger siblings how to rip them straight onto ancient iPods. Seth watched his weird baby keep growing. Not because TV execs made it happen, but because millions of kids with half-broken laptops needed to see a world where a dumb dad could blow up his neighborhood with a single fart joke and still eat dinner with his family like nothing happened. And if that sounds lowbrow, good. That's the point. In a world obsessed with prestige, TV-complicated anti-heroes, muted drama, important statements, Family Guy roared back like a drunk uncle at Thanksgiving. Rude, too loud, totally impossible to ignore. The cult didn't want perfect stories. They wanted the kind of chaos only Quahog could deliver. They wanted to watch Peter fall down the stairs for 30 seconds straight, just because the writers thought the silence was funny. They wanted chicken fights that shattered continuity. They wanted Brian's pretentious monologues undercut by his next horrible decision at the bar. And so they got it. Week after week, season after season, the Griffin family survived, not in spite of their idiocy, but because of it. The resurrection didn't save Family Guy by polishing it up. It locked in the fact that it never needed polishing. It needed fans. It needed DVD players whirring at 3 a.m. It needed dorm hallways echoing with dumb quotes. It needed the haters, too, the moral watchdogs who kept the legend alive every time they gasped at Stewie's next world-ending gadget. By the time the new seasons cemented their cult status, Quahog didn't just feel like a fake town anymore. It felt like a second home for every misfit who'd ever been told to quiet down, get serious, grow up. In Quahog, nobody grows up. That's the point. And that's why it lived. So when the final credits rolled on those early revival seasons, the resurrection arc fully stamped into TV history, Peter still sat on his crusty couch. Stewie still plotted doom from his crib. Brian still raised a martini to his own endless, elegant disappointment. Quahog didn't change. The world did. And so did TV. When the last fade to black of those early revival seasons aired, there was a feeling humming under dorm lights and flickering basement TVs across America. Family Guy had become too big to kill again. Not because it got safer, but because the new breed of fans didn't want safe. They wanted the Griffin plague to spread, infecting every corner of pop culture with a snarl and a smirk. And spread it did. The so-called Quahog effect started small, a few braver-than-average shows lifting the cutaway blueprint, stealing the snarky throwaway musical bit, the irreverent pace, But soon entire late-night blocks were spliced with the DNA of Seth's talking baby and dumb dad dynamic. Where older sitcoms once tiptoed around the censors with clever double entendres, Family Guy came in swinging with jokes so on the nose they practically kicked your teeth in. And for a new generation, that wasn't just acceptable, it was mandatory. Quahog's chaos crawled into the veins of TV writers who'd grown up with Peter's idiocy echoing through their hallways. Sketch shows borrowed the scattershot style. Animated comedies realized they could push the bar, not just flirt with it. Even the big networks, once so quick to pull the plug on anything too sharp, leaned into that same brand of, did they really just say that energy that Family Guy had used like a crowbar to break its own coffin open? And yet, the show itself never pretended to be the classy trailblazer. The genius of the Griffin house wasn't that it invented envelope-pushing comedy. It was that it weaponized it. Seth's team took the stale sitcom format, ripped out the living room walls, threw in time machines, hyper-violent chicken fights, and meta-jokes about the network paying the bills, then sat back to watch the culture flinch. And once people realized they liked flinching, they started demanding more. While all this unfolded, Quahog itself stayed frozen in its weird bubble. That was the trick. The world outside evolved faster internet, sharper memes, streaming's birth, but inside, the Griffin family never learned, never grew, never mellowed out. They were an immovable object that made the unstoppable force of modern TV bend around them. Meanwhile, the cult found new tools. The same college kids who'd swapped bootleg DVDs on dorm steps now spliced Family Guy clips into early YouTube mashups. They made Stewie and Brian lip-sync to pop songs. They turned Peter's drunken rants into ringtones that made teachers furious in the middle of class. The show's DNA dripped into the new digital bloodstream gifs, reaction images, weird fan theories that spiraled into creepypasta corners about how every episode was secretly some cursed nightmare in Stewie's head. Seth, ever the smart ringmaster, didn't fight it. He leaned into the Quahog effect with that sly grin, the one that first cracked open a college animation class, with the life of Larry all those years ago. He knew the show was ridiculous. He knew it was a mess. That was the point. When people asked if the show would ever end, he shrugged and laughed. Probably. But probably not when you expect it. So the writers pushed deeper. Jokes that should have stayed single-use gags turned into running bits that stretched for entire seasons. Cutaways got more aggressive one-off throwaways that functioned like inside jokes for the cult, daring newcomers to keep up or get left behind. And somehow it worked. The Quahog effect didn't just influence other shows, it gave Family Guy its own armor. If the show was self-aware enough to admit it was dumb, crude, and shameless, then what could the critics really say? It had beaten them to the punch every time. Of course, not everyone adored the plague. Parents' groups, watchdog committees, self-appointed moral guardians, they never went away. If anything, they got louder, but by now, every moral outrage felt like free advertising. The kids who loved Family Guy didn't want a clean sitcom about lessons learned and hugs before the credits. They wanted Peter slamming his head through the fourth wall just to yell about a joke the censors wouldn't let them air last week. They wanted Stewie to declare world domination, only to get distracted by his teddy bear. They wanted Brian to pretend to be the show's voice of reason while proving, episode after episode, that he was just as broken as everyone else. The Quahog effect worked backwards, too. When other shows tried to mimic it, they often missed the messy charm. Some got canceled mid-stride. Not everyone could balance dumb dad antics with smart cultural digs and come out looking stronger. Family Guy was an accidental tightrope act. So sloppy on the surface, so sharp underneath, so perfectly unashamed that it became bulletproof by being brazen. By the time new generations stumbled onto Quahog reruns, it was less a show and more a living rumor. The kind of thing your older cousin quoted in the car on the way home from a concert. The thing your high school friend showed you on a scratched laptop in a noisy cafeteria. It wasn't polished prestige, it was filthy gospel. And like any gospel worth spreading, it was repeated, remixed, and rebroadcast in endless new forms. So as the 2000s roared into the age of streaming, one truth stayed nailed to the Griffins' living room wall. Quahog didn't change for the world learned to bend around Quahog. And Seth, somewhere in the voice booth or the writer's room or behind a mic at Comic-Con, watched it all with that smirk that promised, the best punchlines always come from the jokes you're not supposed to tell. The beauty of the Quahog effect wasn't that Family Guy simply influenced a few punchlines in other shows. It warped what an audience expected from an animated sitcom. Suddenly, it wasn't enough for a cartoon to tell tidy stories. Audiences wanted the sense that anything could blow up at any moment. They craved the shock gag at minute 12 that made Grandma leave the room. They wanted the joke so layered in references that rewinding was mandatory. And above all, they wanted to be in on it. Because Quahog was never just a town. It was a secret clubhouse, a place where every inside joke, every callback, every mean jab at Meg or long-winded fight with a giant chicken made the fans feel like co-conspirators. If The Simpsons was a reflection of a typical dysfunctional family, Family Guy was the demented mirror cracked, warped, showing you all the wrong things for a laugh and daring you to keep staring. And the cult didn't just absorb it passively. They took the Griffin brand of nonsense and spun it into a million spin-off riffs. Early YouTube was a graveyard of bootleg clips chopped up into AMVs, remixed into cringy tributes, or redubbed into edgy fan skits. College radio shows dropped Family Guy lines between pop songs. Kids scribbled Stewie on notebooks next to band logos and ASAB stickers. Quahog's characters became stickers on battered laptops, punchlines at parties, the one joke that made your teacher sigh and confiscate your phone. Seth's team, meanwhile, never tried to drag it back to safe territory. Every time someone asked when Family Guy would grow up, the show seemed to get dumber, but underneath that idiocy was a careful, savage genius. A lot of sitcoms go stale because the characters have to change to feel fresh. Not here. Peter Griffin didn't learn. Stewie didn't get cured of his murderous daydreams. If anything, they evolved into twisted adventures that made no sense if you cared about realism. But that was the point. Quahog was a dimension where sitcom rules got tied up, gagged, and stuffed in a trunk, so the audience could enjoy the chaos guilt-free. This raw, ever-looping chaos had a weird side effect. It trained a whole generation of comedy writers, YouTubers, meme lords, and digital pranksters in the fine art of offend, retract nothing, repeat. From edgy stand-up to sketch shows on cable to early internet comedy channels, the fingerprints of Quahog's cutaway style and taboo appetite were obvious. Some tried to carbon copy it and flopped. Others took pieces the rapid pacing, the fourth wall teases, the mocking self-awareness, and spun them into hits of their own. Yet none ever really replaced Family Guy because the cult didn't want a replacement. They wanted more Griffin, more Peter bumbling through a new job each week, more Brian pretending to be the smartest dog alive while making the dumbest mistakes possible, more Meg sighing as the universe dunked on her, only for the audience to wonder if she'd snap and burn Quahog to the ground someday. And so the cycle continued. Each new season layered in new callbacks for the old fans and young. Did they really just do that? Moments for the freshmen tuning in for the first time. The show built its own time capsule of running gags, the chicken fights that defied continuity, the random musical bits that mocked Broadway while being catchier than actual show tunes, the savage cutaways that used flashbacks like grenades tossed into normal scenes. Meanwhile, outside the TV screen, the culture changed too. Streaming killed off the waiting game fans could inhale whole seasons in a night, clip their favorite moments, sling them out on forums, Discord, or whatever site replaced the last one. Family Guy bled into reaction gifs, out-of-context memes, fan art so wrong it circled back to brilliant. It made Quahog more real than real, a mythical town that only made sense if you never expected sense in the first place. Seth knew exactly what he'd unleashed. He once joked that the show was like jazz, if jazz involved fart jokes and murder plots. And he was right. The brilliance of Quahog wasn't that it followed the rules. It was that it reminded you the rules were made up. If the cult didn't want them, they could break them again tomorrow. So by the time those early revival years closed out, Family Guy had burned its name so deep into American TV that it didn't matter if critics rolled their eyes or if watchdogs clutched their pearls. The cult had rewritten the rules. Quahog was an empire now, messy, rude, loud, but bulletproof, because the fans liked it exactly that way. And out there, some kid at a secondhand DVD store was still buying the scratched-up box set that made it all possible, still ripping episodes for their friends, still quoting Peter's dumbest lines at 3 a.m. in a dorm room just to see who laughed hardest. Because in Quahog, nothing really dies. It just resets. Cue the next gag. Maybe the strangest thing about the Griffin family's stubborn immortality is how normal it feels now. In the beginning, those first revival seasons felt like a glitch in the system, a show that got the axe, rose from the grave, and pointed at its own coffin while laughing. But as Quahog settled back onto Sunday nights, what was once impossible became the default. Of course, Peter would be there, slurring through another half-baked scheme. Of course, Stewie would time travel just to ruin Brian's love life again. The loop wasn't a bug. It was the feature. And the fans, they knew. They didn't just tolerate the loop, they worshipped it. Every time Peter reset to factory settings, every time Lois forgave something unforgivable, every time Brian moralized one minute and humiliated himself the next, the cult clapped like an audience at a midnight movie. Because at its heart, Family Guy never promised character growth. It promised familiar chaos. Predictable unpredictability, a world where the shock came from knowing exactly what was about to happen and craving it anyway. This is why the so-called First Cancellation became more than a trivia note. It became a badge of honor, a secret handshake for every fan who could brag, "I was there when the DVDs brought them back." It turned Quahog into a place that existed partly on TV and partly in memory, a town that never aged because we didn't want it to. Other sitcoms gave you closure. Quahog gave you Peter falling down the stairs for the 50th time and made you laugh harder the 50th time than the first. Outside the Griffin house, the world didn't stand still. Other shows rose and fell. The internet morphed from shady LimeWire downloads to streaming giants with entire libraries on demand. But inside that crude animated living room, same brown couch, same off-key piano gags, same conspiracy theory that Stewie might be British royalty or a closeted genius or a cosmic glitch in the space-time continuum, take your pick, depending on which forum you were reading at 3 a.m. It's easy to forget how fragile that loop once was. Those first revival episodes carried the pressure of proving the cult right, proving that the show deserved to live again. And when the ratings ticked up, when the DVDs refused to gather dust, the message was clear. Family Guy wasn't just a show that could come back. It was a show that should come back, whenever it felt like it. Because if Quahog stayed dead, a little part of the fans' own rebellious streak went with it. So the loop deepened. Cutaways got weirder. The chicken fights got longer, more violent, more self-aware. A ritual that broke the story's spine just to remind everyone. This isn't reality. It's Quahog. Nothing here stays buried. The same gag can rise again, meaner than before. And every so often, the show lets you peek behind the curtain. Stewie would break the fourth wall and wink that he knew he was trapped in an endless cycle. Peter would brag about his job on the show, only to get distracted by a fart joke seconds later. Brian would hold up the moral compass like a trophy, only to trip over his own ego. It wasn't just comedy, it was collusion. The writers were daring you to notice how they played the audience like a piano, and the audience loved them for it. Meanwhile, that first resurrection became a blueprint for the entire pop culture graveyard. Other canceled shows now dream of a Family Guy comeback. Network execs pitch reboots and revivals with one goal: bottle that same raw loyalty. But Quahog's magic was never just in the marketing. It was in the unfiltered honesty. Family Guy never pretended to be classier than it was. It never claimed to be above the low blow, the easy joke, the mean spirit that made Meg a punchline and Chris a lovable doofus. It was a trashy dinner you ordered at midnight because you knew it would hit the spot every time. And when you were done, there it was waiting for you the next week. Same couch, same living room, same off-key piano riff sliding you into the credits, same promise. Don't worry, we'll blow up the chicken again next season. The kids who swapped bootlegs in the early days, they're older now. Some worked 9-to-5s they hate. Some became parents who watched Quahog chaos to remember when they didn't have bills. Some became writers themselves, scribbling pilots and late-night sketches that borrow a trick or two from Seth's endless punchline loop. And Family Guy? Still there. Still rude. Still itself. The power of the loop is its immortality, a joke about the same couch, the same dog, the same cosmic baby genius, each bit layered on decades of in-jokes. Watch it once, and you're confused. Watch it twice, you're in on it. Watch it 10 times, and you're part of the cult that never left. So that first cancellation, that final death, that turned out to be anything but, did more than save Quahog. It infected every episode that followed with a quiet vow. We've died once. Good luck burying us again. The Griffin family wears that vow like armor. Each new season feels like a dare. How far can they push it this time? What taboo can they tickle? What sacred cow can they tip over with one off-key musical number? And in living rooms and bedrooms and dorm basements, the cult tunes in, giggles at the same dumb jokes, and hits play again. Because Quahog's not real, but it is real enough to remind us that nothing that messy, that wrong, that unpolished can truly stay dead. Not when the world outside keeps trying to clean itself up. We need Quahog to stay gross, stay lazy, stay timelessly tacky. We need it to prove that comedy can be shameless and bulletproof. And that's the loop. That's the forever gag that makes the Griffin house stand when slicker shows crumble. It's wild to think that what started as a scrappy experiment by a kid out of Rista, a few scribbled gags about a cranky middle-aged guy named Larry and his talking dog could mutate into a permanent glitch in the TV matrix. Yet here we are, decades later, still watching Peter's mouth hang open in stunned silence after one of Stewie's insults lands too close to home, still watching Brian pour a drink and pretend he's not the show's biggest hypocrite, still laughing when we shouldn't. The final half of this resurrection story isn't really about network execs or DVD sales anymore. It's about the people who refuse to let Quahog drift into TV trivia. It's the thousands of fans who quote entire scenes for no reason other than it makes the day lighter. It's the tired college kid who slams on an old rerun at 3 a.m. because the world is spinning too fast. But Peter Griffin, tripping over his own logic, is still the same as it ever was. See, that's the secret glue. Family Guy was never polished, never pretended to be high art. It's blue-collar cartoon chaos with zero respect for consistency, which is exactly what makes it timeless. You could cut a random frame from Season 3 and stick it next to a gag from Season 18, and if you squint, they'd rhyme. Maybe Peter looks a little cleaner. Cutaways are flashier, but the heart is the same dumb, beautiful mess. And if you think about it, that's what the first cancellation ironically gave us. A permanent permission slip to keep breaking the rules. When Fox pulled the plug the first time, it wasn't an ending, it was an origin story for a new kind of audience loyalty. People realized they could vote with their wallets and their bootlegs, their fan sites and crude early memes. They realized a show could die on prime time and live forever in college dorms, late-night gas station DVD bins, and in endless online reposts. So when Family Guy came back, it carried that pirate flag proudly. The writers leaned into it. They knew the cult didn't want subtlety. They wanted the same ragged energy, the same taboo-busting punchlines. They wanted the Griffin family to stay frozen in the weirdest slice of American suburbia, always half a step away from total disaster, always snapping back to the couch by the time the credits rolled. That's the contradiction that powers the loop. Quahog never really changes, yet the world outside does. The jokes mutate, the targets shift. What used to be edgy in 2000 might be tame now, so the writers push it further. New controversies spark, new social media storms blow through, and every so often, the same question pops up. Should Family Guy end? But the cult knows the answer before it's asked. No, it can't. Or maybe it can, but only when the audience finally stops quoting Peter's dumbest lines under their breath. Every time the show test the limits kills off Brian, resurrects Brian, makes a joke so far over the line that people swear they'll never watch again, it's just flexing the same resurrection muscle that made the show unkillable in the first place. For every critic rolling their eyes, there's a fresh wave of college kids giggling at clips on TikTok, discovering Quahog for the first time like it's a relic from an older, funnier age. And so the loop loops on. The early cancellation that once threatened to sink the Griffin clan now serves as a warped badge of honor, a ghost story the writers keep alive through meta-gags and fourth-wall cracks. Seth himself sometimes mocks how weird it is that this accidental empire survived at all. He said it in interviews. It wasn't meant to last. And yet it did, because the cult refused to let go. And maybe that's the greatest irony. A show that rose by mocking pop culture now is pop culture. Peter's face is a meme. Stewie's voice is a ringtone. The chicken fight is a gif that lands in random comment threads to kill an argument with nonsense. The cult keeps the loop running not because they expect it to get smarter or neater, but because they love that it never will. The final gag is that there's no final gag. Quahog can't wrap up with a bow. The moment it tries to tie loose ends, it stops being Quahog. So instead, the living room resets. The piano riff rolls in. Peter does something so dumb, it circles back to genius. Stewie plots to destroy the world, only to get distracted by a teddy bear. Brian lights a cigarette he swore he quit years ago. Lois sighs. Meg sighs harder. And somewhere, A kid who wasn't even alive when the first DVDs came out hits play next episode and laughs at a joke so old it's new again. The loop keeps turning, the cult keeps watching, and the final resurrection isn't really final because Quahog was never built to stay buried. It's built to linger like a guilty chuckle you can't hold in, like a punchline that hits harder when you know you shouldn't laugh, like an inside joke you pass down, season after season, friend after friend, meme after meme. So as the curtain falls on this early chapter on the wild years of getting canceled, clawed back, and crowned the king of primetime second chances, one truth stands. Family Guy didn't cheat death once. It taught the world how to laugh in its face. And in Quahog, somewhere beyond that broken fourth wall, the Griffin family's TV hums to life again. Another episode, another dumb idea, another cutaway gag that makes you roll your eyes and giggle anyway. Same couch, same piano, same promise. We're not done. We never will be.